Welcome, my friends, to this presentation on the existential and phenomenological roots of positive psychology. So this course is on sort of positive psychology and coaching and leadership. And in this week's presentation, I really want to focus on this core theoretical foundation that's provided for the field of positive psychology by its deep roots in both existential and phenomenological philosophical traditions. And with this presentation, I'm going to try to present this as a bit of a timeline, and this is tough because existentialism in itself could be a whole course and it could be a whole program, and phenomenology is another huge field of study. So what I tried to do with this presentation is sort of give a taste of and a glimpse into 19 of the key voices in this movement, and from Zarathustra and Plato, and this is in sort of timeline, chronological order. We're going to go with Zarathustra and then Plato and Pascal and Kant and Hegel and Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky and James and Nietzsche and Husserl and Buber and Kafka and Tillich and Heidegger and Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, Camus and Wilson. And so I'm going to try to paint this picture of these existential and phenomenological roots and where they give or why they give this kind of depth of meaning and increased significance to the power behind the field of positive psychology. Cheers, grab a coffee, grab a nice chair, and a pad of paper and a pen, and catch you on the next slide. Just a little word art or whatever that I made. I thought that you'd find it kind of cool because I made this to be the thumbnail for this video. But first of all, 2 points I want to make to you as my students, but also as a lot of you are growing in your video creation skill. One thing that's interesting to think is that if you make a PowerPoint slide and you make a really nice one and you just save it as a JPEG, that can be your thumbnail on YouTube. It's already the perfect size, and then you can make it exactly what you want. And then the other thing is like you'll see that this will be mine for this one. And what was the other thing I was going to tell you about that? Oh yeah, there's an add-on, that these word clouds or whatever, there's an add-on for the new PowerPoint that you basically just write down all the words and then you like kind of highlight them and generate a word cloud, and it makes it. It's pretty sweet. If you need it for like a project or something, that could be a cool addition for some kind of project you're working on. All right, this is what we're going to talk about. The names on this slide are the absolute heavyweights of philosophy. Schopenhauer, Dostoevsky, William James, Husserl, Plato, Colin Wilson and Pascal, Heidegger, Immanuel Kant. Like, these are Plato, Kafka, Hegel, Zoroaster or Zarathustra sometimes called, Merleau-Ponty. It messed up that one because it's a hyphenated word and it didn't know what to do with it. Yeah, Sartre, Tillich, Buber. This is what we're going to be Camus. This is what we're going to be focusing on today, and how these people provide this like real depth and existential meaning to what we're going to be talking about later, and what a lot of the philosophical argument for things we're going to be doing later is found in these epic philosophers. Welcome. The first person I want to reference here, the first person I want to talk about, Zarathustra or Zoroaster, kind of depending on the spelling and the focus, right? Because this guy was in the Iran area, and so he was an ancient Persian prophet, and he taught a lot about these kind of core. The reason I'm referring to him, right, is because, like, say for example, Nietzsche references him a lot, Plato references him. A lot of what I was trying to do is kind of think of where these ideas come from, and if you go to their oldest kind of attributed, who the people I'm talking about today kind of talk about who influenced them, it goes a lot, often, or at least several of them go back to this individual, right, whose knowledge about who he was and how he shapes into the history of that area and into the history of what's going to become Western philosophical thought, the classics, right? Because this individual had a huge impact on people like Plato and Aristotle and some of the major philosophers, and then those philosophers influenced everyone else, right? So like when people are then reading Plato and reading how Plato's talking about, say for example, this guy. So some of the influence, it's like you don't have to influence everyone. If you influence Plato, and Plato writes about ideas, and then those ideas influence everybody, that's a huge influence. And you had this idea of dualism, right? And this idea of, well, the mind-body idea, and then this idea of free choice, and this idea of having purification rituals. And if anyone wants to look into this, here's a little heads up. The next assignment I'm going to do, I want you to pick one of these people that I'm going to talk about today and do a bit of a deep dive into them and do some kind of project on their ideas, and I'm going to like present it in the actual assignment in like its own video with like a clear description and clear questions. But the kind of point I want to just kind of leave in your mind is this idea is, as we go through these 19 people, to kind of be thinking like which one sort of speaks to you as interesting. This is the oldest one, right? So this is like 6th, 7th century BC. So keep in mind BC refers to before Christ. Sometimes you hear it spelt as BCE to refer to before Common Era. So, and this is because of the Romanized calendar. And then, so anything that say like the 6th century BC to the 7th century BC is like the 600 to 700 years before that. So you'd have to add that to the 2022, right? To get how many years ago. So now sometimes you see people write years ago instead of BC. So like, and oftentimes it's when it's non-human dates that would make no sense to use kind of our calendar. So like the easiest example that comes to mind immediately, just because my kid's into dinosaurs, it's like dinosaurs. It's like, when was a T-Rex? It doesn't give you a BC date. It gives you a million years ago, an MYA date. So it's just different dating systems. This idea of purification rituals, that there were things to do to cleanse the soul for the next step the soul was taking on its journey. Right, so these, but that there's this like psychological, because I'm trying to make the point that this wasn't, because yes, of course there were ancient religions, but that this was this early philosophical attempt, or somebody preaching ideas related to philosophical attempts to deal with this, the complexity of existence. This is a segue from that last slide where I was talking about this quest to understand the essence of existence, this quest to understand who are we and what are we doing here, and what is the world, and what is the fact that we have different interpretations from each other of it, and what are dreams, and what is God, and what is truth, and what is beauty, and what is friendship, and what is love, and what is mystery. Right, so I have as the background in this picture the oracle at Delphi, and it's like this, well, it's where they would make these pilgrimages, right, to these festivals of Dionysus, the Eleusinian mysteries. It's like the religion that they call it sometimes the religion with no name. Sorry if you can hear a bit of the plumbing. The religion with no name, or the oldest religion. And it's this ancient Greco-Roman religion that you've heard of, and you've heard of Poseidon and Apollo and Zeus, and probably heard the legend of Hercules. And do you think that Plato thought that there was a guy that lived in the water that was basically like the dad from The Little Mermaid, Poseidon? These are some of the smartest philosophical, historical, literary thinkers of all time. It's like their visualizations of the gods was heavily linked with their engagement with things like psychedelics and these festives at Ulysses, these festivals at Ulysses, and these this spiked wine, these oracles at Delphi, these visionary experiences. So it's like these people that get presented as this like cold, like here's a textbook on Plato, go get bored. It's like, no, these were actually like people that were highly interesting, engaged, exploring the nature of what it means to be a human. Once you went to Delphi, once you had an experience of the oracle, you were only allowed, and it was this party, right? It was this festival where you'd have these religious experiences, and you could only go once, and you could never talk about it. And it was this sacred religious experience where we now know that they were almost certainly drinking wine with some type of hallucinogenic, and they were having these experiences that, like, either Socrates or Plato, but I think Socrates said experiences that were more real than real. And so the people that had been there and been through that ritual were initiated into that ancient mystery school. So to understand this quote, the uninitiated are people that haven't done that. Take a look around then and see that none of the uninitiated are listening. Now, by the uninitiated, I mean the people who believe in nothing that they can't grasp in their hands, and who allow that, and who will not allow that actions or generation of anything invisible can have real existence. It's like the uninitiated, who I mean by that, I actually mean like the people that think that like only if this pen only exists if I can see it in Israel and I can touch it. And if you're talking about like ideas like the universe and God and all these things that are like not things that I can grasp in my hands, then I can't believe it. And he's like, well, there's a difference. They're not listening. And see, the reason and Plato, it's like I was just trying to pick like the struggle with a presentation like this is to not just get bogged down with Plato, right? Because it's like almost his, and I have there kind of above the quote there, just that bold, ideas are real. Plato was very focused on this idea of the existence of non-material things, which is as existential as ideas get. All right, let's keep going. I hope that you're going to find this interesting. And these are my only two BC people. We're going to do a huge jump all the way up to the Enlightenment. So we're going to bypass all of the Greek Roman period, bypass basically the entire Middle Ages and medieval period, and go all the way to Pascal as our next one.
Blaise Pascal was a 17th century mathematician and philosopher who made great contributions to both fields. You might have heard of Pascal's triangle? He was born on June 19, 1623. His mother died when he was about 3 years old, so his father moved Blaise and his two sisters to Paris and took charge of educating them. Blaise took to math like a fish to water. While other kids were like, I like girls, Pascal was like, I like conic sections. But his dad worried Blaise would reject the classics, so he banned math from their studies. Blaise took to studying geometry behind his dad's back and made up a lot of his own geometry terms. As a teenager, he started working on calculating machines, known as Pascal's calculators. Over 13 years, he built 20 machines and 50 prototypes, including one of the first mechanical calculators. But it wasn't a huge commercial success. It was cumbersome and it was really expensive. It became more of a status symbol for the rich than an actual machine. Pascal is also credited with coming up with Pascal's triangle. It's basically an addition pyramid. Each number equals the sum of the two numbers above it. This creates patterns along the diagonals and the rows and can be used to solve things like probability, combinations, and exponents. Outside of math, he dabbled in the sciences, invented the hydraulic press and the syringe. Pascal may have been a man of science, but his most famous work was entirely unscientific. He had one of the most unique perspectives on religion and faith, particularly the belief in God. Pascal was by no means the first scientist to question or attempt to prove or disprove the existence of God, but his take was unique in its pragmatism. The way he saw it, like a mathematician, the odds of success were what mattered. If you do believe in God and he exists, you win. If he doesn't, well, nothing lost, nothing gained. So Pascal argued, bet on God. You have nothing to lose. This hedging your bets approach to religion became known as Pascal's wager, and it opened up an entirely new way of thinking about religion. Pascal viewed the world in terms of maximizing benefits and returns. So even if you're not a religious person or you take issue with Pascal's wager, you can't deny that Pascal ushered in a new school of religious and philosophical thought. Pascal continued to write on religion and philosophy until 1662, when he died from a stomach tumor at just 39.
It can be said that the 18th century most certainly belonged to the likes of Hume and Voltaire, but the 19th...
See, this is the problem with the presentation like this, is like where to start, where to stop, like, and who not to include. Like, Voltaire and David Hume could both be on this, right? Voltaire in his defense of personal liberty, and that's on the left, and then on the right, the guy with the hat on or whatever is David Hume's huge critic of Christianity, but also like a huge proponent of this idea of subjectivity, or one should not assume the philosophy of David Hume is nothing more than a subjective conclusion. He says, so anyways, that's David Hume. David Hume's a really interesting guy. But Kant comes along, and this video is about to say it, but then the next century kind of belongs to these guys, or to Kant. And Kant really has this, I'm looking at my list here, right? So far we've looked at Zarathustra, Plato, and Pascal, and now we're looking at Kant, and Kant's about to have this like huge impact on all the people coming next, Hegel and Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and Heidegger, right? All these huge names in the history of psychology and specifically philosophy. Actually, I should have said not psychology, although they all have relevance to psychology. So let's get into this on Kant.
Would be awarded to the immensely influential philosophy of Immanuel Kant. As said best by the philosopher and historian Will Durant, it was Kant who labored best to rescue mind from matter, who argued so irrefutably, because so unintelligibly, against the uses of pure reason, and who, by the prestidigitation of his thought, brought back to life, magician-wise, the dear beliefs of the ancient faith. I believe it would be foolish and near impossible to capture the immensely complex philosophy of Immanuel Kant in just one video, so instead we will focus on aspects of his transcendental idealism, namely on the claim that the external world is unknowable and that the reality we know is only mere interpretation from our mind. Keep in mind as we continue that your interpretation may differ slightly than my own. Before getting started, I would be incredibly grateful if you would subscribe to the channel.
See, like, he's about to make this point that one of Immanuel Kant's huge influences is this shift towards subjectivity, that your own experience, your own perception has a real nature to it. And that's actually an interesting idea, right? There's this interesting idea that there's like the world, and then there's like me and you looking at it, and it's not just me and you looking at a world as one thing. There's actually like also our own private perceptions of that world that exist in some subjective way, right? So this is what this word subjective specifically means.
Post videos relating to Eastern and Western philosophy every week. I would like to begin with a quote from Kant himself. He said, "All our knowledge begins with the senses, proceeds then to the understanding,
sensation,
and ends with reason.
Perception.
There is nothing higher than reason."
Logic.
Beneath the surface of this statement from Kant, there is much
reasoning.
to unpack.
Why?
First, that there are two distinctions of knowledge that must be understood. knowledge that is a priori and knowledge that is a posteriori. A priori, meaning in Latin from the former, refers to knowledge that can be known without experience or data from the senses. A prime example
So sometimes you hear people use this term a priori to mean like information you knew before having to learn things about it. Human reflexes are a priori, from the former. It's like information you're bringing to the situation. Yeah, it's a complex idea because a priori means like, yeah, knowledge that can be known without experience or data from the senses. So without experience meaning without going through it or without seeing it. Information that can be known without going through it or seeing it yourself, basically.
of this, as said by Kant, is mathematical equations, for we cannot conceive that
math.
2 plus 2 can or ever will in this world or any other equal anything but 4, because 2 plus 2 and 4 are one and the same expressed differently. Likewise, we cannot begin to think that the shortest distance between 2 points will ever be anything but a straight line. A posteriori, meaning in Latin from the latter, refers to knowledge gained through sensory experience.
Right, so if you say, okay, there's this point and there's this point, and what's the fastest way between it? This is kind of an interesting idea, right? That I'm talking about the last one still, where you're saying that like without seeing the line and without taking any data, or sorry, without seeing the two places you're talking about and without getting any data and without having been there, I can tell you for 100% sure that the fastest way between those two places is a straight line. And that might sound like kind of like, oh, thanks, Mike, for the most obvious point ever, but that's what that means. So now, a posteriori, after, right? Priori before, posteriori, posterior after, postscript, post production, right? Post usually means after. This refers to knowledge gained through sensory experiences. So gained through sensory experiences, but cannot be understood independently. Okay, refers to knowledge that can be gained through our senses and cannot be understood or independent of that sensory knowledge. Okay, I just messed myself up there. So yeah, so it's both understood by our senses and can't be understood without our senses, like say for example like blue.
And cannot be understood independently of reference to sensory knowledge. For example, the statement, "My dog is black," would not be knowable without first gaining sight confirmation of his black color. This knowledge, unlike a priori knowledge, is subject to change upon one gaining broader evidence. Second, we move to the senses. For Kant said, all knowledge begins with the senses. In order to understand Kant, we must understand the terms phenomena and noumena as he understood them. He believed that all objects can be categorized as one or the other. In regards to phenomena, Kant explains this term as the realities or appearances that are interpreted from our minds. And in regards to noumena, he explains this to be the things that are interpreted from our...
That's a good quote for you. So phenomena, the realities or appearances that are interpreted from our minds. Right, and this is kind of what phenomenology really is, right? And remember, Kant is coming now. He was born in 1724, and Husserl, the person that's like the real father of phenomenology, is coming about 100 years later. So this is like a good 130 years before, and he's saying this idea of like, okay, there's the world, but there's also you making sense of the world. The realities or appearances that are interpreted from our mind.
Our minds. And in regards to noumena, he explains this to be the
Noumena.
things that exist regardless of our mind's interpretations.
right? Like it's like black holes in the universe. It like doesn't matter if you know what black holes in the universe are, or it doesn't matter if you know what the asteroid belt is. Things that exist regardless of our mind's interpretation.
Kant claimed that this knowledge will always be unknown because we only have the ability to know the world that is presented to us from our mind. Kant does not mean to convey that an external world outside of our mind's personal perception does not exist, but only that our mind limits reality. That phenomena and phenomena only can be known since we only know the world around us through our senses.
That's an important distinction. It's not like he's saying that everything outside is fake and the only thing that's real is your thoughts, because that's not at all what he's saying. What he's saying is your brain decodes your environment and creates an interpretive experience that's uniquely yours.
I think an example is in order to better explain. Let us take an orange as this example. We feel the shape and texture of its rind, the cool temperature of its core. We smell the citrus entering through our nostrils. We see the bright orange color reflecting through our retinas, and we taste the combination of sweetness and bitterness saturating our taste buds. When combined, these sensations have created this thing we name an orange. All of this is phenomena, what we can know. Outside of these sensations, we can conceive that this thing presumably still exists. This is noumena, and will always be unknowable as our sensation, Kant believed, is all that we can truly know. Anything else is only speculation. This is the limitation of the mind. He believed that speculation about noumena should be avoided and said that metaphysics is a dark ocean without shores or lighthouse, strewn with many a philosophic wreck. Instead of this speculation, we should spend our hours examining our own mental abilities and how they relate to what we perceive in our own personal reality. By this self-examination, he thought we would learn more about important philosophic questions. With this view of metaphysics, I suppose Kant, as said by Durant, did not foresee that the greatest of all metaphysical tempests was to be of his own blowing. The effort to answer these problems that transcend sense experience Kant calls his transcendental philosophy, and is not so much concerned with the objects as with our a priori concepts of objects. Even so matter-of-fact a man as Schopenhauer and rabid a heretic as Nietzsche accepted him and looked upon him.
And that makes sense with the word transcendental, right? Because tran means across, transcendental to travel across the meaning of it's not the cup, it's what the cup means to you. And notice like all these people, why I'm trying to tie these together and make this point is like all these points are around this idea of like what is even this existence, this life that we kind of just take as a given, right? And this is what existential existence-ism, sort of existentialism. Okay, so let's get to this. I see Nietzsche there. Let's see what he's going to say here.
His reduction of the world to mere appearance as the indispensable preliminary of every possible philosophy. In future videos, I plan to expatiate on this as well as other aspects of Kant's philosophy. I attempted to explain.
Right, so I kind of messed up how they had that quote, but what he was saying there is that even people like Nietzsche, who were huge attacks, that he said who was attacking like a rabid heretic, like a dog that had rabies, attacking the church. Speaking of Nietzsche, you saying like even people like Nietzsche had huge respect for Kant. That's how much of a respected intellect he was.
In this small part of Kant's philosophy to the best of my current ability, and as said earlier in the video, the identity and credibility of this philosophy remains debated. I hope this video has helped you understand this one aspect of his incredibly complex philosophy. If you would like to learn more about Immanuel Kant, Will Durant recommended starting with Wallace's Kant, and for a great criticism of the work, to read Schopenhauer's World, Will, and Idea. I could also recommend reading Durant's section on Kant in his book The Story of Philosophy. I will put the links to these as well as the audiobook version of this work of Durant's in the description below. I hope this video has helped you in some way. If so, don't forget to subscribe to see more on Eastern and Western philosophy. As always, thank you for talking philosophy with me. Until next time.
Pretty solid video. It's really hard making videos of someone like Kant, right? Like someone who's maybe the most influential philosopher of the modern era. Alright, got heavyweights coming up. Next is Hegel. Catch you on the next slide. I don't know why that image kind of hiccuped there, but Hegel's the next person I want to talk about, and I have a video on the next one, so you'll notice this, and I meant to make this point a couple times because I recorded aspects of this out of order, but I'm going to kind of do a combo of some of the videos I'm going to watch with you and give a whole bunch of comments, and some of the kind of more concise videos I'm just going to let play, or not concise, but there's just certain ones that do a really kind of neat and tidy job and fit in well, and I'm just going to let play, and some of that's so that this presentation isn't 5 hours. And so this next video coming up is going to be a nice, concise discussion of Hegel. But I wanted you to have this in your notes, right? So an interesting way to do this presentation would be to, as you're going along, you're making this timeline and maybe putting a few key points of each person. With Hegel, you want to talk about this idea of absolute idealism. And in the next video, she's going to discuss all these things. This idea of the world spirit, or the progression of world history, and she'll talk about that. And then this idea of what a dialectic is, or the thesis and the antithesis, and how those this is one of Hegel's core ideas, how those kind of engage in dialogue, a dialectic process between thesis and antithesis, the thing and the opposite of the thing. And then he called that synthesis, and it's like it's a pretty complex idea, but I think the woman on the next slide, who's a philosophy prof, does an awesome job explaining it. So, but I wanted you to have these kind of simplified, quick pointers for your note.
Today we're talking about Hegel's theory of world history and the development of spirit within it. For Hegel, reason rules the world. Therefore, world history is a rational process. World history for Hegel is the gradual emergence of spirit in the world as freedom. As such, world history tracks the increasing freedom and self-consciousness of human beings. In other words, world history is the unfolding of spirit in time. So, what is spirit? Well, spirit, or Geist in German, is the engine of history. It's a sort of principle of activity and motion, or as Hegel calls it, self-consciousness coming to know itself. Now, this might sound very abstract, like, where is the spirit? What is it? But for Hegel, it's really permeating everything in the world. It's not some kind of mysterious woo-woo force, but rather the truth of movement, development, activity. Things are always changing. They're always in a process of becoming. We can never say with certainty that this thing is what it is, and it is fixed that way. Hegel's trying to get, through his notion of spirit, at the insight that the world is always in flux, in a state of change. And this is an interesting point when you think about history, because the claim is that history is actually essential for understanding the way things are. There's not some sort of permanent, eternal, unchanging truth, and then history is sort of the predetermined way that unfolds chronologically. No, rather, the way things are is historical in its very being. Spirit, as this principle of activity that is driving things, is also driving them forward to a certain end for Hegel. History is teleological on his view, which is a term that came up in the lecture on Kant. Teleological means aiming towards a certain logical, reasonable end. And so, for Hegel, things are always in a state of progress, to put it simply. Spirit is driving towards freedom. So Hegel describes freedom as the truth of spirit, and says that when we talk about world history as spirit actualizing itself in concrete events throughout history, through individual people's desires. What we're actually saying is that spirit is becoming more and more concrete. And this means that things are becoming freer. They're unifying, becoming more self-conscious. And when we are self-conscious, we are able to rule ourselves, govern ourselves. And that is the truth of freedom for Hegel. The goal towards which spirit is driving is thus, in a sense, freedom. But specifically speaking, Hegel really talks about it as the idea, which is another notion that comes up a lot in Hegel's work. The idea for Hegel is the synthesis of subjectivity and objectivity, synthesis of matter and spirit, synthesis of really all these things that seem disparate and separate. And the idea actually needs human activity in order to help bring it about. It's not something sort of hovering up in the ether that needs to, enter human history in some way. No, it is actually immanent within human history, and it needs human activity in order to self-actualize. So humans have an essential role in the self-development of spirit as it strives for its goal, which is the idea. The goal of world history is the fulfillment of the concept of spirit. Spirit is conscious of its own freedom, and it has actualized freedom completely. And that is also what Hegel calls the idea. So one thing you'll find is that it's easy to get sort of caught up in these different terms, but Hegel is really just trying to get at this notion that history is in a state of development, and that this state of development is immanent within the conditions of the world. It doesn't need sort of something outside of it. For Hegel, the means are always internal to the end. On page 26, Hegel says that the idea and human passion are the two elements of world history. And they come together concretely in the freedom that we receive through living within a state. The idea, as we said earlier, is the synthesis of subjectivity and objectivity. It's the totality of all things. But its antithesis is passion. Passion is the arbitrary, free, or subjective will, say, of an individual person. And passion, Hegel says, even though it's antithetical to the idea, has a role to play in the actualization of reason. It provides a sort of driving force in what Hegel calls the cunning of reason. So think about the way that as a person, you have individual interests, you have individual desires, you have individual goals, and those might seem to be unique to you, right? Hegel says, well, in trying to attain those desires, you are actually unwittingly doing the work of reason. You are helping actualize spirit in the world, even though you don't know it. And even if you're not doing good actions, our actions, Hegel says, have meaning outside of our intentions and even outside of the specific actions we undertake. So he gives the example, for instance, of an arsonist who lights a house on fire in order to get revenge, say it's the house of his enemy, but then accidentally ends up lighting an entire neighborhood on fire and destroying a lot of property and even killing people on the way. Hegel says that person's actions had all sorts of consequences that that person didn't intend. And this is where Hegel's seeming optimism starts to get a little dark, because he talks about, for instance, the slaughter bench of history. Reason uses human passions in order to attain its own end, and in so doing, a lot of individual humans end up not attaining their goals or end up being destructive or even being destroyed. In this picture that Hegel gives of individuals being the unwitting instruments of reason, he focuses on a particular type of person whom he calls the world historical individual, or the hero. The world historical individual is a person whose aims embody a universal concept. They contain the will of the world spirit. So there are plenty of people whose particular passions, even though they're still part of this teleological progress of history aren't particularly useful for reason. So for instance, if my particular passion is to create a small business in my community, maybe it's a used car dealership, then, in achieving that, I'm still part of the progress of history, according to Hegel, but I have a somewhat localized effect. There are others, however, whose effects go far beyond what they even could have anticipated. Perhaps it's somebody who starts a movement, or somebody who lives a kind of quiet life while they're alive, but then afterward becomes venerated as a hero and ends up embodying a value that then culture really takes to and furthers for centuries to come. A lot of religious figures are like this. Hegel says that for these individuals, the source of their actions comes from inner spirit. It's actually hidden to them themselves. So world historical individuals may or may not believe that they have an important mission to accomplish. And it doesn't really matter whether they do or not for Hegel, because at the end of the day, they are bringing the idea into consciousness out of themselves, even when they're not aware of it. Let's say something now about the state. For Hegel, the state is the object of world history. And what he means by the state is actually pretty broad. So he's not just talking about government here, although that's part of it. He's also talking about all dimensions of cultural life, right? Arts, religion, philosophy, education. In addition, he talks about ethical life. And ethical life doesn't strictly mean here our moral actions. It actually just means our norms, our ways of living, our customs, right? It's Sittlichkeit in German. And it also pertains to our environment. So the state for Hegel actually even extends to our climate, our geography, and which countries surround us as our neighbors. And finally, it pertains to something we'll talk about a little bit next time, which is the Volksgeist, or the spirit of a people. Geist, spirit, Volk, people. For Hegel, the state is freedom that is actually rationally self-conscious. And one thing that's important here is Hegel's claim that only within the state can freedom be actualized. So this is in contrast, say, with a pretty common conception of freedom that we have, which is that in the state of nature, humans are completely free, but we're also pretty violent, and infringing on each other's desires all the time. And so what we need to do is to enter a society where our freedoms are constrained. So I can retain certain freedoms, but I can't, say, retain the freedom to kill another person. That notion wherein the state is what constrains your freedom, but freedom is something you have naturally because it's just the freedom to follow your desires, is very different from what Hegel has in mind. Hegel says, no, freedom requires self-consciousness and it requires recognition within a community. So it's actually only through the state, which includes all of those things I mentioned a little bit ago, not just government, but also cultural life and ethical life and so on and so forth. Only there do I actually have the freedom that Hegel's talking about. And in a perfect world, he says on page 27, the state's universal goal is in line, in union with the private interests of citizens. Of course, doesn't often work out that way. For Hegel, the state is the practical and lived union of the universal and the particular. And what holds people together in the state is reason. So this is what makes the state different, say, from the family structure. Hegel says that the family structure is based on blood ties or kinship ties, right? Whereas the state is based on ties of reason, which are universal. And if this all still sounds pretty abstract, think about the fact that we encounter reason through the state in a literal physical sense, right? By encountering laws, for instance. Or say I'm going to a national park to go climbing and I have to stop at a kiosk and pay my way in, right? That's a way of me encountering the state. I'm saying, okay, I'll pay $20 in order to support the upkeep of the park so I can go climbing here and keep it accessible for everybody. Or when I'm driving down the highway. Driving down the highway is a great example of the state structure and the fact that it enables freedom for me because it allows me to get from point A to point B much more quickly than if we didn't have the infrastructure providing for that. You can also see the state structure embodied in individuals who do service for the state. Say, a judge. Looking forward to talking to you about Hegel this week.
This video is sponsored by the book summary service, Blinkist.
Blinkist. I hope you're doing well, my friends, and actually this is the first one I'm recording, the first slide, even though it's slide 9 of the presentation. Saturday night, I just finished, the kids are in bed, my wife's in bed, just finished the presentation and getting it all set up, so I think I'm going to just record in a few of the videos that I want to add. And may as well start with the heavyweight just to kind of get in the groove. And I hope that this is kind of, I will have already set this up at this point, but I hope this is cool how I'm going to try to do a combination of some of these as kind of reaction videos and some of these as standalone and then some of them as more traditional lecture, and try to do it all in one big presentation. So let's get into this. This should be an epic one. Oh, I almost pressed stop. I gotta use this side.
Being one of the first philosophers to ever really question the value of existence, to systematically combine Eastern and Western modes of thinking, and to introduce the arts as a serious philosophical focus, Arthur Schopenhauer is perhaps one of the darkest and most comprehensive philosophers in Western history. Schopenhauer was born in 1788 in what is now Gdańsk, Poland, but spent the majority of his childhood in Hamburg, Germany, after his family moved there when he was 5. He was born to a wealthy family, his father being a highly successful international merchant. As a result of this, young Schopenhauer would be expected to follow in his father's footsteps. However, from an early age, he had no interest in business, and instead found himself compelled towards academics. And after going on a trip around Europe with his parents to prepare him for his merchant career, the greater exposure he would receive to the pervasive suffering and poverty of the world would cause him to become all the more interested in pursuing the path of scholarship and intellectually examining, down to its very core, how the world worked and why, or perhaps more accurately, how and why it appeared to work so negatively.
So negatively? Yikes. This is why it's like the darkest philosopher or whatever the title was. And one thing I want to say is I love this guy's videos. And what I really tried to do with this presentation is, and I should say this now because I kind of am reflecting on it because I've been thinking about this a lot and sculpting this all week and stuff. And what existentialism is, what phenomenology is, how it relates to psychology and our understanding of ourselves and our world. And I thought that the coolest way to do it was to show you it in some kind of timeline and not necessarily just like kill you with dates and definitions, but to try to show it, try to somehow show it. And I think some of these individual YouTube creators make such cool, like this guy makes awesome videos, like these are just awesome videos. And alright Mike, quit blabbing, right? Let's get back to it. Anyways, I'm already having fun and I've been doing this for like 3 minutes, so I hope that this class is enjoyable for you. Cheers. Let's keep going. Cheers, I said mid-class. Alright, cheers, my coffee. It's late. I've been slamming coffee and it's like 12:30 at night on a Saturday. Perfect time to be talking about existentialism. Let's keep this going.
After eventually going against his family's ready-made path of international business, Schopenhauer would attend the University of Göttingen in 1809, where, in his 3rd semester, he would become more introduced and focused on philosophy. The following year, he would transfer to the University of Berlin to study under a better philosophy program led by distinguished philosophy lecturers of the time. However, Schopenhauer would soon find academic philosophy to be unnecessarily obscure, detached from real concerns of life, and often tethered to theological agendas, all of which he despised. Eventually, he left the academic intellectual circuit and spent the following decade philosophizing and writing on his own. By age 30, Schopenhauer had published the 2 works that would go on to define his entire career, contain his complete, unified philosophical system from which he would never deviate, and eventually influence the entire course of Western thinking with. The first groundwork of his philosophy was established in his dissertation on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, published in 1813, and his entire unified philosophical system, including his metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, value judgments, and so forth, was laid out in his subsequent masterwork, The World as Will and Representation, published in 1819. Despite these impressive works going on to hold major stake in Western philosophy, influencing some of the greatest thinkers and schools of thought thereafter, during this time, they would go mostly unnoticed. Over the decades following his early work, throughout his 30s and 40s, Schopenhauer would spend his time working to be a lecturer at university, as well as a translator of French to English prose, while continuing to write on and off along the side. He found very little success in all of it. His lectures were unpopular, his translations received very little interest, and his philosophical work remained mostly overlooked. Only by around his 50s did Schopenhauer finally start to receive any notable recognition at all, and only after publishing a book of essays and aphorisms in 1851 would he achieve the status of fame, which he would remain in for the rest of his life until he died in 1860 at the age of 72. In terms of Schopenhauer's philosophical system established within his work, it is relevant to note that it leaned heavily on the work of his predecessor, Immanuel Kant. In Schopenhauer's mind, he was completing Kant's system of transcendental idealism. Building off his interpretation of Kant, Schopenhauer essentially suggested that the
So, by this point in the presentation, I will have already talked about Kant and transcendental idealism, so this is the connection to that.
world as we know and experience it is exclusively a representation created by our mind through our senses and forms of cognition. Consequently, we cannot access the true nature of external objects outside our mental, phenomenological experience of them. Deviating from Kant, however, Schopenhauer would go on to argue that not only can we not know nor access the varying objects of the world as they really are outside of our conscious experience, but there is in fact no plurality of objects beyond our experience at all. Rather, beyond our experience is, according to Schopenhauer, a singular, unified oneness of reality, a sort of essence or force that drives existence that is beyond time, beyond space, and beyond all objectification. Schopenhauer would go on to explore and define this force by referencing and probing into the experience of living within the body, suggesting that this is the only thing in the world that we have access to that is not solely a mental representation of an object, but is also a first-hand, subjective experience from within it. From here, Schopenhauer would suggest that what is found from within, at the core of our being, is an unconscious, restless, striving force towards survival, nourishment, and reproduction. He would term this force the will to live. Essentially, this would lead him to the conclusion that reality is made up of two sides, one side being the plurality of things as they are represented to a conscious apparatus, and the other side being the singular, unified force of the will. Hence the name of his masterwork, The World as Will and Representation.
As will?
It is worth noting that the term will can perhaps
As will and representation. Think of what representation means, right? Like, there's like this mug, and then there's how this mug is represented in your mind when you're looking at it. The music, and like, sorry to get all excited, but I just find that to try to explain a complex philosopher in like 8 minutes, even if this whole presentation seems long, it's like I might chop it up into 2 or something like that, but oh man, it does such a great job kind of catching the complexity of the person. But yeah, so this idea of will and representation, sorry to get talkative there, but let's get back to this.
Be misleading, and that it might seem to imply an intention or human-like conscious motivation. But the will, for Schopenhauer, is a blind, unconscious striving with no goal or purpose other than to keep itself going for the sake of keeping itself going. All of the material world operates by and through this will, moving, striving, consuming, and violently expressing itself in order to sustain itself. Schopenhauer's work was largely a response to Kant and the Western philosophical tradition, but his work also contains distinct notes of Hinduism and Buddhism. His conclusion of the nature of reality is strikingly similar to that of both. and his qualitative assessment of reality's negative relationship with the conscious self mirrors ideas central to Buddhism. This made Schopenhauer one of the first philosophers to ever really combine Eastern and Western thinking in such a systematically comprehensive way. Especially similar to Buddhism, Schopenhauer would top off his philosophical medley with a layer of dark, unwavering pessimism. Unless suffering is the direct and immediate object of life, our existence must entirely fail of its aim. It is absurd to look upon the enormous amount of pain that abounds everywhere in the world and originates in needs and necessities inseparable from life itself as serving no purpose at all and the result of mere chance. Each separate misfortune, as it comes, seems no doubt to be something exceptional, but misfortune in general is the rule, Schopenhauer wrote. As a qualitative assessment of the nature of reality, he would describe the will to live as a sort of malevolent force that we, as individual selves, become victims of in its process of continuation, deceived by our own mind and body to go against our fundamental interests and yearnings in order to carry it out. Since the will has no aim or purpose other than its perpetual continuation, then the will can never be satisfied, and since we are expressions of it, neither can we. Thus, we are driven to consume beings, things, ideas, goals, circumstances, and all the rest, constantly hoping we will feel a satisfaction or happiness as a result, while constantly being left in the wake of each achievement unsatisfied. Human life must be some kind of mistake. The truth of this will be sufficiently obvious if we only remember that man is a compound of needs and necessities hard to satisfy, and that even when they are satisfied, all he obtains is a state of painlessness where nothing remains to him but abandonment to boredom, Schopenhauer wrote. As the best possible ways of sort of escaping and dealing with this, Schopenhauer would put forth two primary methods. One, engaging in arts and philosophy, and two, the practicing of asceticism, traditionally being the deprivation of nearly all desire, self-indulgence, and everything past the bare minimum. In this latter method, Schopenhauer felt that by denying the will from being fed, so to speak, one would turn the will against itself and overcome it. However, he also recognized the sheer difficulty of this for the majority of people and suggested the average person should simply make their best efforts towards letting go of ideals of happiness and pleasure, and rather focus on the minimization of pain. Happiness in life, for Schopenhauer, is not a matter of joys and pleasures, but rather the reduction and freedom from pain as much as possible. The safest way of not being very miserable is to not expect to be very happy, he wrote. Alternatively, engaging in arts and philosophy, in Schopenhauer's mind, served as another, more accessible method. He felt that good art could provide a source of clarity into the nature and problems of being without any of the illusion or drapery. And while engaging in this sort of art, one would have a transcendent-like experience that provides a relief and...
So quick point, that would be a tie to like positive psychology, right? This is how you could make a philosophical tie from his work to positive psychology. He's basically making an argument for therapeutic rec or any kind of like applied artistic therapy.
Comfort from existence. As a result of this concept, Schopenhauer would end up being one of the first thinkers to ever really introduce philosophical significance to the arts, and would eventually become known by many as the artist's philosopher. Of course, throughout his work in general, Schopenhauer makes large, often unprovable, and unknowable claims about the nature of reality and the value of existing within it. Some of which is validly constructed and worth considering, but some of which is likely not. Ultimately, any attempt to define and assess the side of reality beyond logic and reason through systematic logic and reason is perhaps paradoxical in a way that is beyond repair. What precisely is the will? Where does it come from? Where does it end? And how can we know or prove it? And in terms of Schopenhauer's suggestion that one should turn against the will through an ascetic process of self-denial, if all of life operates through the will, to turn against it would seem to merely be the will turning against the will for reasons that favor it. And there can be no turning against the will if the will is doing the turning. Alternatively, considering the view of Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher who notably followed in Schopenhauer's footsteps, the endless cycle of desire and dissatisfaction caused by the will is actually a good thing that we can use as fuel towards the process of self-overcoming and growth, which we can then obtain life's meaning from. Of course, this is the more pleasant of the two interpretations,
So
but it isn't clear.
right, that the actual despair actually has a therapeutic, generative, motivational impact. Before, my comment about Buddhism didn't make sense. I misunderstood with Schopenhauer the aesthetic, or that there's this like religious tradition that's common in a lot of traditions. There's I can think of Christian examples, I can think of Hindu examples, or I can think of I think there even is schools within Buddhism, but it's basically the idea of like extreme self-denial as a path to like spiritualism or whatever. Yeah, so Schopenhauer was like just such an interesting person, but like very pessimistic, but also, so anyway, so it's going to talk about how he relates to Nietzsche, another person we're going to be talking about today. And this is going to be kind of one of my points, is that these people are all like interacted and aware of each other, and everyone's sort of commenting on everybody else. And I'm going to try to tell this story in a timeline to give some coherence to it. But yeah, this link to Nietzsche, I'm just going to back up a tiny bit. Where am I? So see this guy here, and it's like, you can almost picture this guy, and you know, I know nothing about this guy in this image, obviously, but what I can read into that is this is what is meant by like this aesthetic idea of like complete denial of anything that like tastes good or is good, probably complete celibacy, most of the time spent in prayer, probably very basic bedding, and actually places where they lay, very basic clothing, like it looks like he's just basically wearing like a pair of shorts or like a cloth mid garment or whatever. And then it's like probably very basic food, very basic everything. Okay, so now the connection to Nietzsche.
The will for reasons that favor it, and there can be no turning against the will if the will is doing the turning. Alternatively, considering the view of Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher who notably followed in Schopenhauer's footsteps, the endless cycle of desire and dissatisfaction caused by the will is actually a good thing that we can use as fuel towards the process of self-overcoming and growth, which we can then obtain life's meaning from. Of course, this is the more pleasant of the two interpretations, but it isn't clear which is more apt and/or accurate, if either. Ultimately, Schopenhauer is another surprising yet seemingly common story where a highly important thinker, artist, or writer barely caught any recognition in their life, if at all, only to die and end up with their name in nearly every history book on the subject. One trait these stories do all seem to have in common, though, is a refusal to stop. A refusal to budge from pursuing and defending the world as one sees it. Schopenhauer never deviated from the philosophical system he created in his 20s and never stopped confidently working to build upon it and reinforce it throughout his life, despite the world seeming to suggest to him he should do otherwise. And yet, now it is hugely significant to the world that he did exactly what he did. For some, his work might be bleak and disconcerting, but for others, his work, like all great works of dark, melancholic honesty, is comforting, relieving, and legitimizing. It reminds us that we are not crazy, and our sadness and suffering are not unfounded, even when they may feel like it. We are merely put in a crazy, sad, violent reality with the mind and body that are often all in conspiracy against us. Because of this, and many other reasons unmentioned, his work would go on to influence artists like Richard Wagner and Gustav Mahler, writers like Marcel Proust, Leo Tolstoy, and Samuel Beckett, and thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, as well as many others, ultimately influencing the course of modern thinking forever. Having been one of the first to properly and philosophically bring the value of life and the possibility of meaning into question, Schopenhauer helped locate the early budding problem of the growing agnostic world that philosophy would need to address. With humanity seemingly suspending further out into a void of meaning, his unyielding and fearless confrontation with the nature of existence, including all its horrors and miseries, revealed an opening of new possibilities towards finding answers from within.
Yeah.
This video was sponsored by Blinkist.
Blinkist.
Andy, age 22, sits on the subway reading.
Let the whole
He is
video
currently
go, or
about a
else it
third of the
gets
way
all,
through the book Until the End of Time by Brian Greene. So far, it's a very good book, but it's starting to veer off somewhat unexpectedly from theoretical physics into more soft sciences. More interested in the hard sciences, Andy loses some degree of interest.
Author.
Having already read 4 out of 11 chapters though, he is compelled to keep reading. A couple weeks later, after finishing the book, it never really comes back around to what he was hoping for. Months go by, and Andy finds that he's forgotten most of what was contained.
Yeah, if I don't let the whole video play, sometimes it gets like that piece of video is still like in the file, so then when the video goes to render, it gets all weird. But yeah, actually, the example that they're using is a book, an author I've heard of that wrote a book called, I think, like The Elegant Universe or something. Brian Greene. He's been on like lots of podcasts and stuff like that. Interesting guy. Anyways, I gotta just let this last bit play out. Actually, how long is that? Yeah, another like minute.
In the book. He often has this problem, even with many of his favorites. He sometimes has to reread books, spending a lot of additional time trying to extract the key points again and refresh himself. The whole process of trying to find good books he's interested in, reading them, hoping he's right, returning to them later to refresh, slowly draws down on Andy's reading habits. Only in his later adult years does he really start reading consistently again. Now, in his mid-60s, he is reading a book about a theory in quantum mechanics known as the many worlds interpretation, which essentially suggests that there are near infinite other worlds that exist in parallel to each other, where outcomes of quantum measurements disperse, explaining the randomness in physics. Impossible for Andy to ever know, this theory is in fact true, and at this exact moment, in perfect irony, in another world, another Andy is listening to an audiobook called Fooled by Randomness, which is about the influence of luck on the economy and life. In this particular world, consumer technology has advanced differently, and when Andy was around 22, he was introduced to a website and smartphone app that condenses thousands of nonfiction books into around 15-minute summaries, providing their main ideas and key takeaways. It also provides complete audiobooks and summaries of podcasts, and he is currently using the audiobook feature to listen to the complete version of Fooled by Randomness after having listened to the book summary breakdown. In the same amount of time of his life, using this app, Andy has explored thousands of books, authors, and a huge range of new topics outside his immediate interests. He has maintained a consistent and broad lifelong reading habit, and because of this, he has also discovered a passion for media, which changed the entire course of his career. The app is, of course, Blinkist. And in this world, it also exists. And in this world, the first 100 people to use the link in the description will receive 1 free week of unlimited access, as well as 25% off a full membership. The free 7-day trial can be canceled at any time within the trial period. And of course, thank you so much for watching in general, and see you next video.
Awesome video. Pursuit of Wonder. Pursuit of Wonder. Subscribe to them on YouTube. Excellent. Long ending ad, but awesome video. So anyways, so some of them would, just to give a quick point here, is like, you might be like a video like that. I basically tried to pick ones that I knew were going to be high quality. So Pursuit of Wonder and Academy Ideas, I'm kind of leaning on heavy in this presentation. And what I basically want to do is like present an idea about the guy, and then, or about the philosopher, and then kind of add in comments and stuff and talk about how they link and try to build this chain of story. Alright, and so this one kind of made an interesting one, positioning Schopenhauer sort of between Immanuel Kant on one side and Nietzsche on the other side. Alright, check you in the next video review. So here's another really interesting one. Dutch philosopher Kierkegaard, Soren. It's like I want to say it is Soren, but I think it's like Soren Kierkegaard, and although his name is a bit tricky in some ways, and it just, I don't know, Kierkegaard's actually kind of easy to say. It just looks like he's going to be tough, but his ideas, one thing that is interesting about him, I find, compared to especially some of the other ones on this list, his writing very easy to understand, in the sense that, not that it's not deep, but that it's clear, very clear. He's very much associated with this idea of truth as being subjective, or this idea of like my truth and your truth being different, and that not meaning that there's no world that exists. This still exists. What you're hearing me say exists. One of you are hearing this lecture and finding it boring, and one of you are hearing it and finding it interesting. Both those things have a subjective reality. And then the fact that you're hearing like my voice, and you're both hearing the same voice, there's an objectiveness to this. So there's, you know, you'd have to almost look at this as layers of experience. This idea of subjective truth I have here will have this huge impact of understandings of human nature that are coming later. Kierkegaard uses this idea of the human being as a passionate animal. Right, so this would be an interesting thing for you to do, like if one of you wanted to pick up this as your assignment and like focus on this idea of, well, what's the difference between Aristotle's idea of a rational animal, or basically like you're a thinking creature, or Kierkegaard's idea that you're a passionate animal, that you're emotional. Are you your thoughts or your emotions? Is Aristotle right? And are you basically a rational thinking animal, or are you an emotional animal? Kierkegaard also had a huge influence on Nietzsche, who's one of the big names we're going to be talking about today. Also, I forgot to highlight one of the points on the last slide, and it's an important one, and it adds the kind of complexity of the history and the interlink between these people. Kierkegaard was also a huge critic of Hegel, the person that was just presented a little while ago. So Kierkegaard was like a lot of his writing was like addressing Hegel directly. I thought this was an awesome quote for you to get the feel of his kind of flavor. And that's sort of what I'm trying to do with these, is like, if I would never end this presentation if I was trying to do a complete overview of these 19 people. They almost all deserve their own presentation. That would actually be a pretty cool course, I think. Could be. But and if you think so too, let me know, and you know, maybe that'll be a future 403 course, because I think I sort of have a green light to make more ones, more courses. But anyways, I'm trying to give you a sort of a flavor or a feel of these different thinkers. There's two ways to be fooled. One's to believe what isn't true, and the other is to refuse to believe what is true. That we have this like human tendency to like make errors of judgment in both directions. Sometimes it's we're believing that things are true when they're not, and sometimes we're refusing to believe things that are true that are. A fire broke out backstage in a theater. The clown came out to warn the public. They thought it was a joke and applauded. He repeated it. The acclaim was greater. I think that's just how the world will come to an end. To general applause from wits who believe it's a joke. Kierkegaard. So, sweetheart, unlike a Hegelian analysis, so like unlike something Hegel would say, Kierkegaard does not look for a way out from anxiety. On the contrary, he stresses its positive role in the flourishing of the human, right? That is actually an important part. Because he's in synthesis, he can be in anxiety, and the more profoundly he's in anxiety, the greater the man, the more he's actually dealing with the angst being caused with engaging with the brutal honesty of experience. This prioritization, or this central focus, whether we're talking about the central focus in dreams or whether we're talking about the central focus just in mental health, it's a fundamental trait of the human being and a typical existential move, eager to assert the positive role in emotion for human life. Charlotte just wanted to say what's up and tell you, yeah, Heidegger, or Kierkegaard. So these people are all like, it's interesting to think how they interact and intersect, right? So like Kierkegaard's highly critical of Hegel, and it's kind of speaking in response back to Hegel, and it's like it's this battle of ideas. It's a battle of ideas is maybe the best way to think of all of this over time, over between people that were very aware of each other. The great Dostoevsky. So this one's a little bit interesting, a little bit different, because there's a couple of these people, like Dostoevsky especially. Kafka would be another one, where, and he's coming later, he's like 5 away, but where they're using story to make their philosophical points, right? Like Dostoevsky might not be technically a philosopher in the sense of like having specific philosophy books, although he sort of does. But what he does is he writes books like The Brothers Kalashnikov, and he writes like what's the other one I'm trying to think of? Lord of the Underworld, which is a really dark book. But then obviously his like by far his most famous book, which this is about, is Crime and Punishment, right? And in Crime and Punishment, this guy, without telling any of the plot, because this happens really early, basically commits this crime early and kind of gets away with it. And then it's like him sort of his mind eating itself, and the question is sort of like, do you ever get away with anything? Crime and Punishment, and this comes from, you know, one of the greatest of these Russian existential writers, and I highly recommend Crime and Punishment, and I actually highly recommend it as an audiobook, because if I don't know if you have Audible or not, but it's one of the best I've listened to, and it's a very dialogue heavy book, right? So it's like, it's almost like, it's, I don't want to say it's like a play, but it's sort of like people talking and this, and it's like the audiobook I listened to was performed by voice actors, and it was, in my opinion, probably the best way to ingest this content, because it's like a lot of the Russian literature is tough because it's heavy. And what I mean by that is, and I mean that out of respect, like it's some of the best writing, and it's like you almost have to like, there's times when you, with Crime and Punishment, you had to like, I almost had to set the book down, but I was listening to it, so it was like I almost have to like pause it and be like, man. And where I really would find it would be like, because it's like, it's just dark and kind of depressed and heavy, and but not nihilistic, forget everything, like existentially heavy would be the word. Like I hadn't even really read through that quote I had on the screen, paused at the start of the video, right? Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart. Raskolnikov. Like that's like the main character. That's the person that kills the person. And again, if you're like, oh, Mike just leaked the ending, it's like, first of all, this book's hardcore old. Second of all, it's like, I didn't leak the ending at all. You could know that, and still, you would have known that you know, an hour into reading it anyways. I was going to say right away, but it's not right away, but it's the opening. So anyways, Crime and Punishment may be the greatest book ever written. It's definitely on the list. So let's listen to why you should read this book. So this is what I'm trying to do with this presentation, is I didn't want to, I wanted to take a few that were real deep dives. So like my real deep dive videos are going to be Schopenhauer, James, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. And it's hard to argue that. It's like, you want to go to war philosophically, it's like, if we're going to a battle, it's like, I'll take on my team Heidegger, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and William James. That's not bad. That is an all-star team, right? So it's like, with those ones, I wanted to go a bit deeper and spend a bit more time. And then for some of the ones that had like a real important place, but I wanted to sort of touch in, like say for example, Kafka, Pascal, even Buber and Tillich. it's like some of these other ones, even Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, I want to place them in. So for some of them, I'm gonna like kind of do slides, and by this point, this is slide 14. So I'm recording this out of order. So like by the time you're here, you'll understand what I'm doing. But some of the slides are gonna be like these basically reaction video style things, and some of them are gonna be like more lecture. Anyways, I don't need to say that. You know what I'm doing. Crime and punishment.
What drives someone to kill in cold blood? What goes through the murderer's mind? And what kind of a society breeds?
This is, sorry to pause immediately, but this is one of the things that Dostoevsky's so amazing at, is painting characters, right? So like the person that gets, because he doesn't want, like, okay, so say if there's a story and it's about a guy that kills another person, and the person that kills was like a really good person, and it's really easy to like say that the killing was wrong. But what if that person was like a terrible person and a really easy person to not like, and then the person kills them, and is it still wrong? And so what Dostoevsky's amazing at is like, he's not going to give you a crime that's like an easy one. He's going to give you one that is like almost justifiable, that you can almost sweep under the rug. But that attempt to sweep under the rug, how that destroys the psyche. And so like what I'm basically saying is he makes steel man arguments, not straw man arguments. Which is big time respectable.
Such people. Over 150 years ago, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky took these questions up in what would become one of the best-known works of Russian literature, Crime and Punishment. First serialized in a literary magazine in 1866, the novel tells the story of Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov, a young law student in St. Petersburg. Raskolnikov lives in abject poverty, and at the start of the story has run out of funds to continue his studies. Letters from his rural home only add to his distress when he realizes how much his mother and sister have sacrificed for his success. Increasingly desperate after selling.
Now, this book is like so much of what's going on in his head, right? So he's in this like bad place. He's like running out of money. Then he gets this like letter, like he loves his sister, he loves his mother. He's this like letter from them saying that like times are tough where they are, and what's keeping them going is sort of their knowledge of him doing so well. So picture that, like you're sitting there almost at your end, and you get a letter from the only people that you care about that say that they're at their end, and the only thing that's keeping them going is you doing so well, and you're like, well, I'm not doing so well. Like, so just to set that scene, it's an interesting psychological dynamic.
The last of his valuables to an elderly pawnbroker, he resolves on a plan to murder and rob her. But the impact of carrying out this
Let me just add two things. So then he goes, so he has this, like, these last, like, because I've read it, so I'm just going to add a little bit as it goes here, because it's doing a quick, like, 4-minute thing. And I'll make this like an hour. No, I'm just joking. I'm trying to be concise, even though I can. This isn't going to be a concise presentation. Well, it's hopefully concise and long. But what happens in this scene is, like, he has the little things that he does have left, he brings to this pawnbroker, and he's like, tries to get like some money, and she just gives him like, just basically rips him off and gives him like a really strong man, or a really like basically just takes advantage of the situation that he's in a bad position and has to get something, and so she gives him very little for things that are very valuable, and he's very resentful, and he leaves, and he decides he's going to kill her and take it back. So that brings you to this.
unthinkable act proves to be more than he was prepared for. Though the novel is sometimes cited as one of the first psychological thrillers, its scope reaches far beyond Raskolnikov's inner turmoil. From dank taverns to dilapidated apartments and claustrophobic police stations, the underbelly of 19th century St. Petersburg is brought to life by Dostoevsky.
That's it. It's like, this is what I'm about to say is a weird thing to say, but it's like, I read this book and all of a sudden felt like I just understood Russia. And I don't mean that as like the complex military history of the country. I don't mean that in terms of, I obviously don't know the language. I almost can't explain it to you unless you read it. With that, and I keep using the word, and I don't even know if this is an acceptable or the right word, but this, like, I want to keep saying Russian existentialism. This, like, because remember, these were very suppressed people. It was very rough. It would have been rough in St. Petersburg, right? A lot of this is happening in rough, poor taverns. Right, the one book's called Lord of the Underworld, so think of what that would kind of entitle. Right, and this time Russia's a place where, like, at the governmental level is very almost royalty-ish, and then there's this huge poor population, and there's this a lot of alcohol, but a lot of depressed drinking, if you know what I mean by that. Very different than it's not a party scene at all. It's a drowning sorrows scene.
Dostoevsky's searing prose. We're introduced to characters such as Marmeladov, a miserable former official who has drank his family into ruin, and Svidrigailov, an unhinged and lecherous nobleman. As Raskolnikov's own family arrives in town, their moral innocence stands in stark contrast to the depravity of those around them.
So I gotta just keep pausing, and I'm sorry, but the book is so amazing because he's going through, just picture this guy's like going through this breakdown crisis in this intense situation, intense city, just committed this murder, has kind of got away with it, but there's all these like other factors, and he even like gets so obsessed about it. This is another piece I'll add, but gets so obsessed about it, he needs to know what people think about it. Like, he needs to know, like, do the police know anything about this? So he like pretends and kind of fakes to be a witness to come and give an account of what it was like that night, so that he can kind of hear what they have to say. And then he gets into the situation where he's like almost telling on himself, and he's like realizing what he's doing. And this is like very much like, if you've read this is the weirdest connection ever, but if you've read Catcher in the Rye, or a book like that where it's like you're very much in the head of the character, this book is big time like that. And so you're like, when I can remember, I was going to share this earlier and I got lost on my topic, which, you know, is so unlike me, but I can remember when I was listening to this book a lot during the move, and I was like cleaning stuff, and like, and then I remember my wife being like asking me to go to some like family thing, and she being like having to like snap my brain out of this like, well, Russian existentialist kind of way of thinking, because I was so deep into this Dostoevsky book. It's one of the most powerful writers.
Even as their fates grow increasingly intertwined, this bleak portrait of Russians.
Then his innocent family comes. So you have that intense, this is the whole reason I paused. You had that whole intense situation, and then his mom and sister show up to the scene too. These two, like, representing sort of innocence, lost history, what's good in a difficult world, representing all of these things.
Society reflects the author's own complex life experiences and evolving ideas. As a young writer who left behind a promising military career, Fyodor had been attracted to ideas of socialism and reform, and joined a circle of intellectuals to discuss radical texts banned by the imperial government. Upon exposure, members of this group, including Dostoevsky, were arrested. Many were sentenced to death, only to be subjected to a mock execution and last-minute pardon from the Tsar. Dostoevsky spent the next 4 years in a Siberian labor camp before being released in 1854.
And they would do that in Russia too. Like, think of how intense, think of what a mock execution is. Like, they're not joking. They don't mean joke. They mean fake. They mean you thinking you're gonna be killed right until the point where the trigger pulls, and then you realizing they're playing with you. Not haha fun playing with you. we control you, playing with you.
The experience left him with a far more pessimistic view of social reform, and his focus shifted towards spiritual concerns. In the 1864 novella Notes from Underground, he expounded on his belief that utopian Western philosophies could never satisfy the contradictory yearnings of the human soul. Crime and Punishment was conceived.
Yeah. Okay, welcome to this video, Crime and Punishment. Just joking. I made a mistake and accidentally clicked the wrong thing. And so it sent us to the next slide. And just since I had went on a bunch of big rants, instead of doing that all over, let's start here. Okay, so in case you ever need to do that, you just duplicate your slide, start where you left off. Because I know I'm trying to shape all of you into an army of video producing magicians. Alright, let's do this. And a lot of it, PowerPoint. PowerPoint's an amazing video editing software nowadays. But I accidentally pressed click outside of the box and it went to the next slide. That's why we're doing this in 2 slides. Back to the video.
Concerns. In the 1864 novella Notes from Underground, he expounded on his belief that utopian Western philosophies could never satisfy the contradictory yearnings of the human soul.
Ooh, that philosophy, man, that's a devastating point. That the philosophies that he was seeing and being exposed to, he thought that those could never nourish and actually help heal the human soul. Notes from the Underground is devastating because it's like this one, I think it's a prison guard explaining to another new prison guard sort of their system and his whole like understanding of it from his long career in how to break people, and his like, and just this real depressed, dark ideology, and you kind of hear it being explained from one person to the other. That's a pretty short read, and it's intensely interesting.
Crime and Punishment was conceived and completed the following year, picking up on many of the same themes. In many ways, the novel follows a common narrative thread where a promising youth is seduced and corrupted by the dangers of urban life. But its social critique cuts far deeper. Raskolnikov rationalizes that his own advancement at the cost of the exploitative pawnbroker's death would be a net benefit to society. In doing so, he echoes the doctrines of egoism and utilitarianism embraced by many of Dostoevsky's contemporary intellectuals. And in believing that his intelligence allows him to transcend moral taboos, Raskolnikov cuts himself off from his own humanity. Yet although the book is deeply concerned with morality, Crime and Punishment never comes across as merely moralizing, with each character given their own distinctive and convincing voice. One of the most remarkable things about Crime and Punishment is its ability to thrill despite the details of the central murder being revealed in the first act. Raskolnikov's crime is clear, but it's only through Dostoevsky's gripping account of the ensuing social and psychological turmoil that we learn the true nature of his punishment and the possibility of redemption.
Social and psychological
You can
turmoil.
download a free audio version of Crime and Punishment from audible.com/TED-Ed. Anthony Heald's gripping narration animates each character with delightful precision. Support TED-Ed's nonprofit mission as you sink deeper and deeper into Dostoevsky's moral quagmire.
So apparently you can get it for free through Audible. Maybe it's per free trial, but they always get you with the subscription. All right, catch you on the next slide.
The 20th century mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead once wrote, "In Western literature there are four great thinkers, whose services to civilized thought rest largely on their achievements in philosophical assemblage. These men are Plato, Aristotle, Leibniz, and William James."
Yeah, what a group, eh? Plato, Aristotle, Leibniz, who's like one of the most famous math guys ever, and William James. So William James, quick, who's the father of psychology? You might want to say Sigmund Freud, right? And Sigmund Freud definitely is in a lot of ways, and is certainly the father of what we could call European psychology, and the father of sort of American psychology, or more specifically a kind of branch of philosophy called pragmatism, is William James. And William James wrote still probably one of the best books trying to talk about the relationship between psychology and spirituality, called The Varieties of Religious Experience, and that's still one of the best books at that attempt, and he wrote that right around the turn of the century. So yeah, let's get into William James.
In this lecture, we are going to examine some of the ideas of one of these individuals, namely the American philosopher William James. During the years 1901 and 1902, James delivered a series of lectures titled Varieties of Religious Experience, in which he presented a fascinating contrast between those he called healthy-minded and those he referred to as sick souls, and it is this topic which will be the concern of our lecture. However, before we begin, it will be useful to briefly discuss James's views on religion. Today, religion is a very polarizing subject. Most people automatically associate religion with the major organized religions, and hence their attitudes towards the organized religions will often determine their views on the subject of religion as a whole. In fact, even at the turn of the 20th century, when James...
Right, and you know, let's just be honest with ourselves for a sec. This might be you. This might be a lot of the people watching, that a lot of your... And me too, it's like a lot of what we see the church is what, or I just said it, right? A lot of what we see religion is what we see the church as. And it's like we didn't like going there, and we thought that this person there was annoying, and that this person was kind of full of it, and that this, it's like it. And so James is sort of saying, like, one of the things he wants to talk about, well, one's attitude towards this kind of organized religion, and this organized kind of social grouping and all that stuff I just said, sort of shapes their view of religion as a whole, or at least it can.
James was delivering his lectures, this seemed to be the case. For as James said, "When we hear the word religion nowadays, we think inevitably of some church or other. And to some persons the word church suggests so much hypocrisy and tyranny and meanness and tenacity of superstition that in a wholesale undiscerning way they glory in saying that they are down on religion altogether." The purpose of James's lectures was not to examine the structure, rituals, and dogma of organized religions, but rather he was interested in examining the more personal and experiential aspect of religion, that being the religious or spiritual experiences which arise within individuals.
Right, so in varieties of religious experience, notice that that's not like varieties of religions or something, and then just like, this is Christianity, this is Hinduism, this is Judaism. Although that book is like that. It is separated into chapters based on faiths, but it's not talking about, it's not written like an encyclopedia. It's written like, this is what people that practice this faith do. This is how they express that. This is how it affects them. This is the variety of experience. It's not just theology.
As James put it, "Religion shall mean for us the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. It is evident that out of religion in the sense in which we take it, theologies, philosophies, and ecclesiastical organizations may secondarily grow." Now it should be noted that James leaves it open as to what one considers divine, and he by no means is implying that the divine must be some form of monotheistic God or supreme being. Leaving it up to the individual to decide what they considered divine allowed him to say, "A man's religion might thus be identified with his attitude, whatever it might be, toward what he felt to be the primal truth."
primal truth, the truth below.
But given this
everything
conception
else.
of religion, a further question arises. What was the value of religion according to James? To answer this question, it is helpful to understand that James believed there
Notice how
were
these
two
are all
fundamental teachings to be gained
different
from
looks at
religion.
the essence
And
of
as Robert
existence.
Richardson writes in his biography of James, these were, first, that something is wrong, and second, that it can be set right. In other words, James believed that religious experiences could help humans deal with the inevitable struggles associated with life. These religious experiences, while differing from person to person according to James, share some features in common which help people through their trials and tribulations.
This
A
guy
few
makes
of these
videos in
common features
PowerPoint.
of religious experience which James identified were a new zest which adds itself like a gift to life, an assurance of safety and a temper of peace, and in relation to others, a preponderance of loving affections. Having cleared up what James meant by religion and religious experience, we will now move on to examine his views on the healthy-minded and the sick souls. To James, these represented alternative ways of viewing the world, which, keeping in mind his definition of religion, resulted in different religious temperaments. The healthy-minded were individuals who James associated with what he called the mind cure movement. The leaders in this faith, James said, have had an intuitive belief in the all-saving power of healthy-minded attitudes, in the conquering efficacy of courage, hope, and trust, and a correlative contempt for doubt, fear, worry, and all nervously precautionary states of mind. Based on this description, it is evident that this movement, in one form or another, has continued to be influential up until the present day. For example, many of the self-help books published these days espouse some form of healthy-mindedness, or what is now more commonly called positive thinking. That digression aside, James believed there were definite benefits to adopting the healthy-minded view of life. James, who struggled with depression and pessimism, understood the detrimental effects associated with negative thinking and the rejuvenating.
See, I find it endlessly fascinating that so many of these people that wrote on this topic struggled with these things themselves. Right? Like he's writing about the potential of having this like sick soul worldview, or like we'll see that also with Nietzsche later. It's like it's interesting when these deep thinkers are dealing with things themselves at a very personal level, and also through their writing at like the highest level of articulation. Some of the highest levels of articulation that we have in the English language.
Effect positive thinking can have on one's life. However, James also recognized that for some individuals, the healthy-minded view was not appropriate. As James said, there are men who seem to have started life with a bottle or two of champagne inscribed to their credit, whilst others seem to have been born close to the pain threshold, which the slightest irritants fatally send them over. Does it not appear as if one who lived more habitually on one side of the pain threshold might need a different sort of religion from one who habitually lived on the other? In other words, James did not believe that a single religious temperament, or more broadly speaking, a single perspective on life, was appropriate for all individuals. Those individuals who are incapable of living on the positive side of the pain threshold, according to James, would probably not find healthy-mindedness a realistic, beneficial, or even a possible perspective to adopt. Rather, such people cannot help but see the world in a much different light. For them, the suffering.
And that makes sense, right? If you're like overwhelmed by all kinds of things, and in certain situations, telling people that it's mindset related isn't going to be maximizing the helpfulness, right? Like, what he's basically saying is, yeah, like based on like both personality and lifestyle manifestations of like how somebody's life is, it maybe makes them more likely to engage this religious aspect of experience differently. It's a fascinating concept.
Suffering and evil of the world is too real to be ignored. James called this view of life, which was the focus of his lecture titled The Sick Soul, morbid-mindedness. It is likely that most will agree that the morbid-minded view of life is unavoidable for some people due to the circumstances of their lives or their attitudinal disposition. However, many will also suggest that such a view is not desirable and hence should be avoided at all costs. However, this was not James's view, as he said. It seems to me that we are bound to say that morbid-mindedness ranges over the wider scale of experience. The method of averting one's attention from evil and living simply in the light of good is splendid as long as it will work, but it breaks down impotently as soon as melancholy comes, and even though one be quite free from melancholy oneself, there is no doubt that healthy-mindedness is inadequate as a philosophical doctrine, because the evil facts which it refuses positively to account for are a genuine portion of reality, and they may after all be the best key to life's significance, and possibly the only openers of our eyes to the deepest levels of truth. Furthermore, individuals who are stricken with morbid-mindedness should not be seen as weak or cowardly according to James. Instead, some of the greatest individuals in history have struggled with morbid-mindedness. Utilizing one such man as an example, James asks, "When such a conquering optimist as Goethe can express himself in this wise, how must it be with less successful men?" What James was referring to was a statement made by Goethe in 1824, which strongly suggests that he was likely someone who would identify himself with the morbid-minded. "I will say nothing," Goethe wrote, "against the course of my existence, but at bottom it has been nothing but pain and burden, and I can affirm that during the whole of my 75 years, I have not had 4 weeks of genuine well-being. It is but the perpetual rolling of a rock that must be raised up again forever." However, while these states of pessimism and despair seem to be an inevitable and necessary part of life, James did not believe they had to be permanent. Rather, James had a great belief in the individual's ability to change their views and eventually escape from the pessimism which often seems so overwhelming. James referred to those who escaped the morbid view of life as the twice-born, and interestingly, James thought there was a connection between the depth of one's despair and the level of appreciation for life that one could eventually achieve. It is, in other words, out of the deepest depths of despair that the most joyous experiences are born. But James was well aware, and this was likely due to his personal struggles, that such a process of being twice born was not easy. And we will finish this lecture with a quote by James which reveals his own personal attitude towards life, which assisted him in his struggle or fight with the darkness of despair. "If this life be not a real fight, in which something is eternally gained for the universe by success, it is no better than a game of private theatricals from which one may withdraw at will. But it feels like a real fight, as if there were something really wild in the universe which we, with all our idealities and faithfulnesses, are needed to redeem."
William James. Did he just end it at the end of that quote? Oh, what an all-star. Cool. "If this life be not a real fight in which something is eternally gained for the universe by success, it's no better than a game of private theatrics from which one may withdraw at will. But it feels like a real fight, as if there was something really wild in the universe which we, with all our idealities and faithfulness, are needed to reform." William James. Sorry, that was just an awesome quote. There was ever a philosopher and a person that was difficult to explain quickly, it would be Nietzsche. Nietzsche had a great complexity, and his complexity is also like, I remember I kind of came a weird way to Nietzsche, because I came to Nietzsche through Carl Jung, and I was really, when I was the age of a lot of you, really influenced by the work of Carl Jung. And Carl Jung talked a lot about Nietzsche, and it hasn't been till I got a bit older till I started getting into Nietzsche, and I can totally see the connection here. And Nietzsche was really concerned about this idea of what he saw as the sort of death of religion in Europe, and how as Christianity was starting to lose its power over people, and that it wasn't being replaced by something better, it was being replaced by nothing. It was being replaced by not just the death of that story, and this isn't making any claim about truth, this is his idea, right, that it was the death of all truth. It was the death of all systems of making sense of things, because he thought basically what had held Europe together for hundreds if not thousands of years was this at least somewhat shared understanding, especially if we're talking about like kind of more modern Europe, that there was this like underpinning of Christianity that made people in, say, Poland and people in France and people in England and people in Portugal having a similar belief structure. And when that's all pulled away, like what's the after effect? It's not just like everyone goes along and just lives their life basically the same. That actually it creates what he thought it would be the existential crisis of humanity. What truth discovers is that the ground of all truth lies in this unquestionable faith in the value of actual truth. That's such a sentence. What truth discovers is that at the ground of all truth lies this, at a certain point, if we get deep enough, there's this faith that there actually is truth. And if everybody's actual, at their core of their idea of what actually is true was religious, and that's destroyed, then that's actually the destruction of all truth. What is called the death of God is also then the death of truth, though not the death of the value of truthfulness. This is an event of immense consequence for the future.
This video is sponsored by the book summary service, Blinkist. The first 100 people to use the link in the description will receive 1 free week of unlimited access, plus 25% off a full membership. Positioned at the forefront of perhaps the most significant shift in Western history, having both predicted the cause and consequence, and going on to provide grandiose, revolutionary ideas as possible solutions, Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the most influential and significant thinkers of modern history. The particular crossroads that Nietzsche stands at is one where the primary path of Western religious faith began to crumble and cave in, leaving a massive empty crater at the end of life's suffering, and what would seem like only one alternative path towards that of pessimism and nihilism.
Right, because he was very concerned with this idea of people are turning away from religion in Europe at this time, right? So this is before World War I or II. This is before the turn of the century, and people are turning away from religion. He's very concerned with like what this is doing to sort of the mind of Europe or whatever at the time, and that like something's going to replace that religious impulse. And his worry is that what's going to replace it is ideology, and specifically this ideology of nihilism, or like the idea of like nothing matters, and therefore if there is no religious truth, then there's no underlying meaning, therefore nothing matters, therefore nihilism, right? And Nietzsche thought that that was like a plague that was like a real philosophical threat to mankind. Okay, so back to this.
His life's work would undertake this newly emerging issue and attempt to forge a new third path away from both religious faith and nihilism, and towards new meaning in human values. Nietzsche was born in 1844 in Saxony, Prussia, which is now part of Eastern Germany. He was born to a modest family living an ordinary, sheltered early childhood. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was the town's Lutheran pastor, which would immediately immerse young Nietzsche into the Christian faith. However, simultaneous to being introduced to it, it would soon be challenged and tested, as his father, the same man who practiced and preached of God, was diagnosed with a terminal brain disease. For a year, his father suffered horribly and then died at the young age of just 35. And the following year, Nietzsche's younger brother, Ludwig, also died. This dichotomy of his religious foundation and early exposure to the irreconcilable, reasonless pain and suffering experienced by good, undeserving people would likely lay some of the groundwork for what would ultimately become the basis of Nietzsche's later work. Following a fairly somber, serious, and lonely childhood, Nietzsche would go on to study theology at the University of Bonn. Both in early schooling and university, he would show strong intellectual promise, excelling especially well in Christian theology. However, following just one semester at university, As he became increasingly critical and intellectually sharp, and after being exposed to various critiques of Christianity, Nietzsche would have no choice but to let go of his Christian faith, fully shedding the skin of his innocence and blind devotion. From here, he would go on to study philology, the study of the history of language, at the University of Leipzig. Here, he would do so well that while still only in his mid-20s, he would go on to be hired as a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, becoming the youngest professor to ever be hired, still to this day. After only a few years of teaching, though, Nietzsche would leave his position, partly because of his growing dissatisfaction and sense of constraint within academia, and partly because of his growing poor health, which he had accumulated by a combination of genetic ailments and what is believed to have been a case of syphilis that he contracted at a brothel. From here, he would go on to live a fairly isolated life, traveling around Europe, moving to and from different climates most suitable for his poor health, and living off his small university pension. He would live primarily and most notably in the Swiss Alps, where he would spend the majority.
This is one of these sad scenarios where it's like such an amazing mind that died such a lonely end to his life of like, just unsatisfying relationships and just terrible health.
Of his remaining sane life. Throughout this time, in between spells of being bedridden by his ailments, a devastating failed love ordeal, degrading friendships and family relations, and depressive and nihilistic states, Nietzsche would spend most of his time walking, thinking, and writing, finding solace, meaning, and reason to continue through his pursuit of philosophy. During this time, he would produce his most influential works, including...
Right, because he was battling those nihilistic feelings himself. It's like, it's obviously understandable why people would feel justification in being jaded or negative or resentful. But Nietzsche makes an argument of like, I just think it's like, well, part of his argument is like how to overcome that or find meaning in the struggle against that. But I think it's interesting to think that like he's saying that this is the plague that we need to avoid sort of psychologically, is this nihilistic view of things not having real meaning. And it's like he was dealing with that thought himself, and he's like, this is like eating at me, like this can't. So it's interesting that it's both what his demon and what he thought is like the demon of the group. Demon's not the right word, but I think you sort of know what I'm trying to say.
Human, all too human, the gay science, thus spoke Zarathustra, beyond good and evil, and on the genealogy of morals. In these works, Nietzsche would lay both the groundwork and early constructions of a new sort of philosophy, a philosophy that would essentially loosen the bolts of all contemporary certainties, all notions of good and evil, all knowledge of true and false, right and wrong. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned, has bled to death under our knives. Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? This is perhaps one of Nietzsche's most quoted and important passages. It is in this line, God is dead, that we find not Nietzsche's celebration of humanity's lost faith, but his stark, intense concern of warning for what it meant. The collapse of Christian faith brought with it, in Nietzsche's mind, the collapse of everything built on it, the whole of European morality, its rationales, and its values. He both predicted and feared that with this collective revelation, without sufficient replacement, humanity would be left to struggle with no clear system or meaning and devolve into widespread despair in the form of nihilism. One of Nietzsche's key ideas at the foundation of his attempt to resolve this issue is the recognition that there is in fact no universal objective truth to be known. There are no facts, only interpretations, he wrote. Nietzsche denied the very construct of any sort of capital T truth and suggested that all attempts to find one were woefully misguided and actually the source of disconnect preventing modern man from rediscovering any meaning in life. The pursuit of universal objectivity or meaning beyond this life took the spirit out of the present earthly human experience of meaning, which is inherently subjective, independent, and expressive. Because of this, Nietzsche would direct his attention primarily to the arts and humanities, believing that creative acts and experiences, be it things like music, philosophy, literature, theater, and so on, could be used as essential means to communicate deeper truths and fill the void of higher connection and meaning. Although, as Nietzsche explored this theory, he would find that
Right, so that's an interesting connection to our course. But he caught the although. Let's see what his although point is here.
cultural arts and humanities were susceptible to becoming dried out, academic, and literature, theater, and so on, could be used as essential means to communicate deeper truths and fill the void of higher connection and meaning. Although, as Nietzsche explored this theory, he would find that cultural arts and humanities were susceptible to becoming dried out, academic, and/or commodified, often losing their luster and dependability. From here, he would turn his attention towards creating a philosophy that detached the individual from dependence on any collective experience or cultural mechanisms, and rather focused on the individual pursuit of creative expression and subjective greatness, placing the creation of meaning squarely in the hands of each individual. This philosophy would be embodied in what Nietzsche would term the Übermensch, or Overman, or sometimes translated as the Superman, which he would first introduce in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The Overman is described as a sort of defiant, confident, independent individual who pursues their personal desires with vigor and dignifies their independent beliefs unapologetically, one who deviates from the collective, exhibits strategic selfishness, and acts with aggressiveness and grandiose. The reason for such characteristics was justified in Nietzsche's view by the fact that a new morality that opposed the moral views rooted in Christianity, which praised weakness and modesty, was needed to better suit the natural condition of human experience, which he felt was comprised and requiring of the desire for vigor, power, and greatness. This view is not without valid critiques and invalid misinterpretations. However, perhaps what is more important than Nietzsche's image of the Overman is what the concept serves to represent. In slightly broader terms, Nietzsche sets up the Overman to function as a sort of idealized version of oneself, an image of a perfect and powerful being who has overcome all their fears and deficiencies, which one can and should set goals to strive towards. Of course, as an ideal, it cannot ever truly be reached, but that is functionally the point. Nietzsche proposed that the world, including the human, operates off of what he called the will to power, an insatiable desire in each living being to manifest power. The world is will to power and nothing besides, he wrote. And according to Nietzsche, this will to power is manifested in the desire for personal growth and satisfied in the pursuance of said growth. It is important to note here that his notion of power is not necessarily referring to physical strength nor power and dominance over others, but rather power over oneself. Psychological and spiritual strength in the form of self-mastery and continuous growth represents the ultimate synchronization with the will to power for Nietzsche, and thus the ultimate synchronization with life itself. The desire and striving towards the ideal of the Overman serves as perpetual fuel to this process of self-growth, as one works through a continued cycle of self-dissatisfaction, self-improvement, and self-rediscovery over and over. For Nietzsche, this process, which he would term self-overcoming, is fundamental to answering and resolving the problem of meaning and value in life. So long as one establishes their goals of growth in the name of what they deem an idealized, life-affirming version of themselves, the process transmutes the suffering of life into something worthwhile and personally redeemable, a sort of alchemy of the spirit that affirms life in the face of its inevitable suffering. If we have our own why in life, we shall get along with almost any how, Nietzsche wrote. Unlike his primary predecessor, Arthur Schopenhauer, who proposed that suffering is best minimized and avoided to the best of one's ability, Nietzsche argued that suffering is, rather, a good thing to be leaned into, embraced, and used as fuel towards the amassing of strength and psychological power. Life is in fact inevitable suffering, and so it is not a matter of if, but for what. The meaninglessness of suffering, not suffering itself, was the curse that lay over mankind so far, Nietzsche wrote. While continuing to write and live an increasingly isolated life in the mountains, still in the early stages of some of his most ambitious philosophical undertakings, Nietzsche would begin to show increasing signs of declining mental health. At 44 years old, after seeing a horse being flogged in a street by its owner, he experienced a mental breakdown, rushing over to the horse, hugging and consoling it, and yelling, "I understand you, I understand you." This strange episode, which marked his last moments out of apparent lucidity, appeared to be an act of complete contradiction to his own philosophy: pity, weakness, and compassion. Soon after, Nietzsche would dip into complete madness, eventually falling into a state of catatonia. One of the most powerful minds of modern history seemingly collapsed under the weight of itself. Whether the cause was organic, latent consequences to his contracted ailments, or the consequence of a mind that pursued too far into itself, becoming stuck on its way back out, is unknown. Before ever coming back out, in 1900, at the young age of 55, Nietzsche died of a stroke. During his lifetime, according to his own standards, Nietzsche might likely be considered a failure. Prior to losing his sanity, he had made very little of himself and saw very little, if not no success. His books didn't sell, and he never really garnered any notable respect or recognition. But following his death, of course, his work would take off, soon gaining massive notice, respect, and worldwide following, some of which unfortunately would lead to horrible, misguided, and ill-conceived applications. However, today, and more generally, Nietzsche's work remains potent, important, and redeemably ingrained in modern thinking. His quotes, aphorisms, and ideas echo through culture every day, both literally and symbolically. And so, in a fittingly ironic way, just how Nietzsche suggested that we must symbolically die throughout life so that we can get out of our own way and become who we really are, sometimes sacrificing ourselves, our personal preservation, health, or sanity in the process of something greater. Perhaps Nietzsche's life and death was just that, a process of self-overcoming, towards self-sacrifice, towards something greater. Of course, Nietzsche's ideas aren't without valid critiques, including this notion of self-overcoming, sacrifice, and greatness. Although his assessments and predictions of modern issues are arguably quite accurate, his resolutions aren't necessarily all-serving. Is suffering and the continual pursuit of desire and self-destruction in the name of growth towards an unattainable end goal really a good thing? And how can one see it as a good thing if they do not? How can one create a life-affirming interpretation of life if their interpretation of life is not affirming? In other words, if one sees life as negative or meaningless, to try to create goals or place themselves on such an interpretation only brings them back to square one, in need of some truth or meaning beyond themselves, something other than what one sees, has, or experiences, which they cannot have. And furthermore, if one does not agree with the initial premise that suffering is good in the name of progress, then the rest might merely be misdirection. Of course, being a philosopher whose work doesn't necessarily follow any linear or systematic structure and can even contradict itself at times, Nietzsche's ideas are open to multiple interpretations. And of course, all the aforementioned is merely a single, very brief one. And more importantly, seeing as how his philosophy caters to this open-ended nature and is arguably not a guide to think in a certain way, but rather a guide to think in one's own way, Nietzsche leaves us the space to, even if we disagree with him, do just as he did and pave a new direction for ourselves.
Yeah.
This video was sponsored by Blinkist. Few people deny the value of healthy reading and learning habits, but for most of us, it is understandably difficult to sustain. The negative feedback loop between feeling like you don't have enough time to consistently read and learn, and the potential value that reading and learning could have on reducing or better managing this sense that you don't have enough time for things you value, is unfortunately paradoxical. The book summary service Blinkist, however, makes escaping this cycle much easier. Condensing thousands of nonfiction books into around 15-minute summaries that can be read or listened to, even while offline, Blinkist makes it easy to absorb and grasp the ideas and key takeaways of complete books in a convenient amount of time. Whether you're interested in philosophy, science, psychology, business, art, or any other common nonfiction subjects, Blinkist can help just about anyone better learn and consistently engage in their curiosities. Better yet, Blinkist now also provides complete audiobooks that you can purchase directly within the app, as well as consolidated summaries of popular podcasts, allowing you to fully delve into topics and authors that you find especially fascinating. If you're interested in learning more about topics related to philosophy and Western history, Blinkist has some great titles including At the Existential Cafe by Sarah Bakewell, which explores the lives and ideas of popular 20th century existential thinkers, as well as A Brief History of Thought by Luke Ferry, which explores the history and key developments of Western philosophy more broadly and how we can apply it to our everyday lives. The first 100 people to use the link in the description will receive 1 free week of unlimited access, as well as 25% off a full membership. The free 7-day trial can be canceled at any time within the trial period. Again, if you're interested, please visit Blinkist.com/pursuitofwonder or click the link in the description below. And of course, thank you so much for watching in general, and see you next video.
I love this class. I think this is going to be fun, I hope. And like in the next few weeks, I'm going to be getting into biology and the evolution part, and like the therapeutic part, and humanitarian part, or like humanism part, I meant. Like Carl Rogers, Viktor Frankl, Rollo May, Fritz Perls, some of those people. Cheers, my friends. Catch you in the next one. Next slide. So, probably the biggest name in phenomenology easily is Husserl, right? Edmund Husserl, and he established this philosophical school of phenomenology, or this German philosophical school looking at, or at least initially German, people like Merleau-Ponty and Sartre, who are coming a little bit later, or French, but this school of looking at the contents of consciousness and phenomenological reduction. So actually there was this really interesting prof at Nipissing that wrote his PhD thesis on Kung Fu and Taoism and phenomenology. You should check out his work. I'm just joking, but I totally did write my thesis on that, and that's like why I think like some of this stuff, and I spent a lot of time talking about Husserl specifically in phenomenological reduction, or like trying to get down to the basis of like what is the difference between your sensation and your perception. And when you're going through your world, you're constantly making sense of things and adding meaning to things, and using that idea of intentionality to, which means you're not just passively going through the world like a robot with camcorders on your face. You're intentionally engaging things and not engaging other things, and that intentionality shapes your experience. He has this idea of transcendental consciousness, which is, has links to ideas Carl Jung will talk about almost 100 years later. Less than that, like 50 years later. He talks about this idea of transcendental consciousness would be an awesome idea for your project. Any of these concepts, right? So one of the ideas I'm trying to do with this presentation, and I've probably already said this at different points, but like I'm trying to give you a couple touch points for all these different people. So if you're interested in exploring their ideas, but the problem with someone like Husserl, and this is, let me just finish this point and then I'll say the problem with Husserl. The point I was going to make is I'm trying to give you all these sort of touch points that you could go and then do your own research, and maybe you do your presentation on sort of like creating a video about what transcendental consciousness is, or what phenomenological intentionality is. That sounds like a mouthful, but think about it. What that really means is that when you're going through your life, you're caring about some things and not about other things, and you're adding meaning to the things that you care about, and the phenomena that you care about, the phenomenology. So phenomenology, the study of how you add meaning to things sort of as you're going through your life, the study of that process of meaning adding, the process of your consciousness as you're moving through your life. And so there's these terms gnosis and noma, and gnosis is this process, this intentional act, or no, sorry, is the process of giving meaning to an act, and noma is what you give, right? So through gnosis you give noma, which is, again, just don't get caught up with that. That's just like German language. All it means is like meaning. It's just meaning. It's like the way that I wanted to explain gnosis and noma is really simple. It's like you check your Gmail and you have 2 messages, and one's from the boy you like that just says, hey. And the other one's like, 10 Secrets of Ancient Philosophy. Okay, so you're sitting there. Let me paint this picture better. You get two messages. One's like, hey, this is the guy or the girl you like. And it just says, hey. Or maybe you don't know what it says. It says, hey, and then whatever. It's just like a nothing message, but it's from the person you like. And then the other one's like, the secrets of the world. And you're like, whatever, that's a spam. So it's like the content and the quality of the messages, right? So if you're an alien from another planet, you're like, that first message was from like a random person that seems to have no difference in significance than anyone else, that she or he seems to really care about. And that other one seemed to have a lot of information that's just immediately dismissed. So it's like really weird in our world how we're like, oh man, I gotta get back to that person immediately. Oh, I'd missed this. Or it's like, that's just my way of saying, like, it's not the thing itself. It's, the psychology term would be like psychological involvement or attachment, but it's this relationship that gets established between the object and the subject. And there's going to be a video coming up that's looking at Sartre that gets really deep into this idea of like, what is this? And then I'm going to kind of end today talking about another guy named Camus that gets into absurdity and this absurd relationship between me and the world that I'm in. And so phenomenology is like, that's a later idea that kind of comes from this initial focus on the fact that we're making sense of our world. Later it gets kind of, the title, it sometimes gets called like this transcendental idealist philosophy, but that was kind of Husserl's attempt to change the name. It kind of, the phenomenology sticks because then a big name's coming right around the corner here, which is going to be Heidegger. So Husserl starts it. Heidegger becomes the biggest name in phenomenology, one of the biggest names in philosophy, period. And then we'll see some of the kind of French carry on in terms of Sartre and Merleau-Ponty coming up. So it's kind of hard to say it's not hard to say what the difference between existential and phenomenology is. Existentialism is focused on these deep questions around existence. Phenomenology is focused on the way that we're making sense of our experience. So you can kind of see how those two things would have points of contact. Before we get on with Heidegger, and this is where, like, if I was just setting up this presentation conceptually, it would have made more sense to go straight from Husserl to Heidegger, right? Because that's where, like, the clear next link of the chain is in terms of development of thought, especially in terms of phenomenology specifically. But I'm kind of trying to stay more true to my timeline. Okay, so I'm trying to present these people in historical order because if I was doing it thought-wise, this would just be a branch tree that would have been impossible to make into a semi-intelligible presentation or understandable presentation. But I want to talk about Martin Buber for a bit, and he had this amazing book, I, Thou, and another guy that seems like would have been a really quality person. And what Buber's idea is that if there's me and you, or I and thou, as you can see in there, right, that was like the key to understanding our experiences, understanding that space between me and you. And he thought he was talking a lot in terms of sort of humanistic psychology, and I'm going to come back to Buber a lot in a couple weeks where I'm talking about therapeutic understandings of group. But he fits in here. I thought that was such a powerful quote. When two people relate to each other authentically and humanly, God is the electricity that surges between them. Again, you don't have to take that as a super religious comment, although obviously it's as religious as a comment could be. So I want you to think of his point there, right? So this is the other thing is within this group of 19 that I have in this list, in this presentation, there's a lot of debate around the central question around God, right? You've seen this. We could almost have separated this into a list of people on the side for and against, right? And you get some heavy critics, and like someone like say Nietzsche, and then you get some like heavy defenders and guys like Kant or even Kierkegaard. or Buber. And the best is that, well, it's so core, right? Because it's like, are we really talking about, do we believe what we're talking about? And Buber thought that the therapeutic potential of relationships characterized by this meaningful understanding of the therapeutic, or like the kind of depth of what that dash between me and you, or I and thou means. If that's, let me just pretend I'm him for a sec. If that gap between me and you is actually God, the universe, spirit, truth, the Tao, what the Greco-Romans would call arche. If it is that, if that's what's between me and you, then maybe we can have a relationship that's spontaneous and reciprocal and based on a shared subjectivity, so I can actually share what my interpretation is like with you in a meaningful way, and we can have recognition and acceptance of our uniqueness, and that this is actually essential for humanhood.
Someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but one morning he was arrested. Thus begins The Trial, one of author Franz Kafka's most well-known novels. K, the protagonist, is arrested out of nowhere and made to go through a bewildering process where neither the cause of his arrest nor the nature of the judicial proceedings are made clear to him. This sort of scenario is considered so characteristic of Kafka's work that scholars came up with a new word for it. Kafkaesque has entered the vernacular to describe unnecessarily complicated and frustrating experiences, like being forced to navigate labyrinths of bureaucracy. But does standing in a long line to fill out confusing paperwork really capture the richness of Kafka's vision? Beyond the word's casual use, what makes something Kafkaesque? Franz Kafka's stories do indeed deal with many mundane and absurd aspects of modern bureaucracy, drawn in part from his experience of working as an insurance clerk in early 20th century Prague. Many of his protagonists are office workers compelled to struggle through a web of obstacles in order to achieve their goals. And often the whole ordeal turns out to be so disorienting and illogical that success becomes pointless in the first place. For example, in the short story Poseidon, the ancient Greek god is an executive so swamped with paperwork that he's never had time to explore his underwater domain. The joke here is that not even a god can handle the amount of paperwork demanded by the modern workplace. But the reason why is telling. He's unwilling to delegate any of the work because he deems everyone else unworthy of the task. Kafka's Poseidon is a prisoner of his own ego. This simple story contains all of the elements that make for a truly Kafkaesque scenario. It's not the absurdity of bureaucracy alone, but the irony of the character's circular reasoning in reaction to it that is emblematic of Kafka's writing. His tragicomic stories act as a form of mythology for the modern industrial age, employing dream logic to explore the relationships between systems of arbitrary power and the individuals caught up in them. Take, for example, Kafka's most famous story, Metamorphosis. When Gregor Samsa awakens one morning to find himself transformed into a giant insect, his greatest worry is that he gets to work on time. Of course, this proves impossible. It was not only the authoritarian realm of the workplace that inspired Kafka. Some of his protagonist's struggles come from within. The short story A Hunger Artist describes a circus performer whose act consists of extended fasts. He's upset that the circus master limits these to 40 days, believing this prevents him from achieving greatness in his art. But when his act loses popularity, he is left free to starve himself to death. The twist comes when he lays dying in anonymity, regretfully admitting that his art has always been a fraud. He fasted not through strength of will, but simply because he never found a food he liked. Even in the trial, which seems to focus directly on bureaucracy, the vague laws and bewildering procedures point to something far more sinister. the terrible momentum of the legal system proves unstoppable even by supposedly powerful officials. This is a system that doesn't serve justice, but whose sole function is to perpetuate itself, what political theorist Hannah Arendt, writing years after Kafka's death, would call tyranny without a tyrant. Yet accompanying the bleakness of Kafka's stories, there's a great deal of humor, rooted in the nonsensical logic of the situations described. So on the one hand, it's easy to recognize the Kafkaesque in today's world. We rely on increasingly convoluted systems of administration that have real consequences on every aspect of our lives. And we find our every word judged by people we can't see according to rules we don't know. On the other hand, by fine-tuning our attention to the absurd, Kafka also reflects our shortcomings back at ourselves. In doing so, he reminds us that the world we live in is one we create and have the power to change for the better.
Here's another really interesting guy, Paul Tillich, who'd be an interesting one for anyone that's a little bit more interested in the religious approaches to this question. He'd be more of a Christian, like a Christian existentialist, and very much stands even up within this kind of top 20 or top 19 existentialist. But his perspective is more religious, and he talks about this difference between existential anxiety or neurotic anxiety, and the language is obviously dated here. But I think you can get this point, and it's an important one, right? It's like, if your anxiety is coming from these existential questions around, like, does my life have meaning, and how can I live in a way that, like, is honoring the beautifulness and the majesticness of human experience, that focusing on that leads us towards creating systems of meaning which are supported by tradition and authority and all this stuff. And he said neurotic anxiety can build a narrow castle of certainty which can be defended with utmost certainty. So he's like, okay, if you don't care about that stuff, right? It's like, if you care about these big picture things, we can work with that. We can act, because those give you directional goals towards things that actually increase the stability of your community. But if you're only focused on your own worries, then you're going to want to create this internally protected, narrow castle, fortress of certitude, which can be defended with certainty, but which is inherently highly limited. That would be another awesome presentation idea. Give me a presentation on the difference between existential and neurotic anxiety, in his words, with the understanding that neurotic is a dated word, obviously. But there's massive historical relevance to look at the work of Paul Tillich, sorry. Almost got him, almost said Peter. Anyways, okay, next slide. So now steps onto the scene the heavyweight of all intellectual heavyweights, the one and only Martin Heidegger. So one of the most difficult to understand concepts in philosophy is, and this is a point I forgot to finish with Husserl, where it's like one of the problems with Husserl is that when you're reading his stuff, he doesn't like clearly define things because it's all just transcripts of his lectures. Right? It's not like him writing a book, so he doesn't give definitions of all of his terms. And Heidegger does a bit more, but the thing with Heidegger is Heidegger's like making up his own words. So he's making up this word, Dasein, right? Which is, or Dasein, or meaning this, like, what does it mean to be a being? What does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be alive and be a being and be something that's experiencing? And the way that you are that being, it's a deep concept. He said that the world's not something separated from that being that you are. There is no nature, nurture. There's just the world. There's just... Right? I didn't glitch there. It's like, that's kind of where the sentence stops. There's just... and it can't be understood outside of this referential totality. That's an awesome way of saying it. Without the matrix. It's like the being doesn't make sense without the matrix around it that gives it meaning. It's like the matrix around it gives it meaning. Referential totality, that's what the matrix means. What the totality of things that you use as reference points to understand things. Your referential totality. What an awesome term. So remember, this Dyson word's a made-up word that means sort of you as a living being. Heidegger thinks that one of the fundamental ways that this living being understands itself in the world is through the moods it's in, right? That this being moving through the world always finds itself, in a certain, I don't know if I said that right, it's German obviously, in a certain mood. Man is not a thinking thing disassociated from the world like Descartes' Cartesian did. The split between mind and body, I think, therefore I am. But rather a being that finds itself in various moods such as anxiety or boredom. It's like we're this being that like finds ourselves in these moods. Interesting relationship between not necessarily emotion and thought, but emotion and being.
Martin Heidegger was born September 26th of 1889. Hailing from Meeskirch, Germany, he is regarded as one of the single most important German philosophers of all time. He is best known for the extremely influential work of Being in Time. To many today, Being in Time is one of the most important pieces of phenomenological and existential philosophy. Phenomenology being the actual phenomena that we experience.
This is a good definition. Phenomenology is the study of structures of consciousness as experienced from the first person point of view. It's actually an awesome definition of it.
What we see, what we taste, what we smell, touch, hear, and feel. Instead of focusing or asking what we really are, it focuses on the phenomena that surrounds our lives. And with existentialism being the emphasis on individual existence and the freedom and choice that we all experience as human individuals. The core purpose of Being in Time is addressing the meaning of being.
So let's look at this for a sec, just to catch this. Existentialism is a philosophy that emphasizes individual existence, freedom and choice. So existence at an individual level. That what makes you so special is that you exist, that you have freedom, that you have choice. It is the view that humans define the meaning, their own meaning in life, and try to make rational decisions, despite existing in an irrational universe, with consciousness as experienced from the first person point of view.
What is it to be? What is common to all entities that make them entities? These questions are so important, and the subsequent creation of Being in Time is hands down one of the most important pieces and turning points in philosophy today. Being in Time in Heideggerian philosophy is the backdrop of 20th century philosophy. Noting this and our future videos around political theory and philosophy, I'm considering this video as one of the single most important videos I make. Heidegger approaches these huge questions through the lens of Dasein, which roughly translates in English to simply being there. In order to get into Being in Time, we need to take a look at what Martin Heidegger is responding to and how he is fundamentally reacting to Enlightenment era philosophy. Because from the time of Descartes, Locke, Kant, and even Hume, we typically looked at the world and human experience through the lens of subject and object. The subject being you, and the object being the world in which you imposed yourself on. The importance of this is the distinction and separation of you and the world. You are two separate things under this philosophy. This distinction between subject and object is something Heidegger doubts. There's something else extremely important here as well. When modern philosophers such as Descartes wanted to explain existence, they wanted to explain themselves. What Descartes ultimately did is he narrowed down his direct path of existence. And ultimately, the conclusion that Descartes came to about existence is that you can essentially strip everything away, and the only thing that provides proof of our existence is the fact that we think. It's the fact that I'm having thoughts to begin with. Therefore, I must be something. Therefore, I must be something that thinks. Yet, Heidegger notices something. He notices a flaw in this reasoning. This cannot be the first proof of our existence. In order to make that abstraction, in order to come up with the idea that I think, therefore I am, there has to be something before that. Before you think, you have to be. And simply being is the very first human experience that we have. This simple being that Heidegger is talking about before thought is ultimately what he is referring to as Dasein. Dasein is an incredibly hard concept to grasp, in my opinion, and it has been very difficult for me. But this human experience of being before thought, before anything else, seems to be the very best example I have stumbled across. Heidegger wanted to completely create new words for this. It may sound like philosophers of the past were talking about what Heidegger is talking about with being, but they really haven't. So in creating new words such as Dasein, he wanted to leave all the prior philosophical baggage behind. And even more importantly, with being and Dasein, Heidegger refers to being more specifically as being in the world. Like the fundamental rejection of subject and object, a person and the world as a separate entity, he views being as something as being hyphenated in the world. This is what he's ultimately referring to in Being in Time as simply being in the world. Because you ultimately can't be without the world. They're not two separate things. The world around you and being as yourself are completely interlinked and necessary for one another. The past modern idea of being a separate agent of the world, roaming around and navigating an external world, was incorrect in Heidegger's eyes, and it missed an incredibly important part of that Dasein, that being. This is why ultimately Martin Heidegger is writing this. He saw the fundamental flaws within Enlightenment era philosophy and the tools used for their analysis. Heidegger believed that the ontology of the Enlightenment era was completely flawed from the get-go. Ontology being the actual philosophical study of the nature of being, becoming, and
this guy's got good definitions. Let's check this one. Yeah, so ontology, the nature of being. So study of the very nature of existence.
And existence. Ontology typically deals with questions about what things exist and what can exist. Because for so long, people have been concerned with what existed. Yet there was one critical mistake that they made in asking this question. They haven't even fundamentally contended with what existence was. This is the ultimate backdrop and reasoning for Martin Heidegger's work, Being in Time. A cynical mind may ask the question, what's the point of this? What's the point of contending with being in the early 1900s? We've experienced the scientific revolution, created robust new political systems, new ways of material life for humanity. Why concern yourself necessarily with the idea of existence? The answer that Heidegger would likely give to this question is that being presupposes everything. Being is the backdrop for nearly every single thing in our lives and comes before every concept that we know and every field of study that we know, such as mathematics, science, physics, and the like. That is why this question of being and fundamentally figuring out what being is important. Because every single thing that we could talk about, every single thing that we could analyze is an already existing thing. Now, on to being. There's all kinds of different realms that exist for being. We understand entities as things, people, animals, concepts, but within these questions, fundamentally we must understand what it is to be human and the being that encapsulates humanity. When concerning ourselves with human epistemology, epistemology being ultimately how we understand knowledge, we see that in a human context, we react and interact with things very distinctly. One very distinct human phenomena Heidegger noticed is that when we discover concepts or truth, The interlinked concepts and other truths that connect themselves to that singular truth often become completely blurred. One example of this is whenever you read, the very text that you are reading is the only real defined text. The text surrounding it becomes blurred. Ultimately, this manifests physically in our life as well. Another famous example of this is whenever you are hammering in a nail into a board, the hammer that you are using, that very tool, almost disappears from your direct consciousness. After hammering away for some time, you forget that the hammer is actually there. Heidegger calls this phenomena ready to hand. You typically only notice the tool or concept that is ready to hand whenever it doesn't work correctly or breaks. So say when you're hammering in the nail, the complete head of the hammer falls apart. You would instantly recognize that it is in your hand at that point. When you do notice this is what Heidegger calls present at hand. The importance of these terms and concept present at hand and ready to hand is that Heidegger ultimately wants to convey to us that the world is to be discovered. It isn't necessarily blank and given to us, but ultimately it is right underneath our nose. To many people, the mark of a great philosopher, the mark of a great academic or teacher, is someone who can explain things that deeply and inherently we already know, but haven't externally formulated it verbally or even consciously. The further conceptual importance of ready to hand to Heidegger is something that many people often miss in his work. When Enlightenment-era philosophers ask the question of what exists whenever they partake in the ontology of the time, existence to them was essentially ready to hand. They never took the fundamental steps in discovering what existence and being really was. Because Enlightenment-era philosophers weren't the only victims of this. This ready-at-hand phenomena is a very human phenomena. Heidegger noticed something extremely important. As human beings living within a society, we often go about our lives in an incredibly robotic way. And this roboticism comes from the very human experience of simply blurring everything out. The world is made up of concepts. The world is made up of tools. And the more humans interact with those tools and concepts, the more they sort of disappear. The more they almost become unimportant. We do this with definitions in language. We do this with relationships. My boyfriend or girlfriend broke up with me and I didn't know what I had until it was gone. In a weird way, we almost just accept this preordained essence in our lives. We accept weird roles designed from society, our family, and even peer group. Heidegger points out we have a tendency to live in what he calls the everydayness. The everydayness is often what separates the inauthentic human experience and the authentic human experience. One's sense of self, of what one is to do with their life and how one is supposed to live, for the most part is given from the outside and an inauthentic experience of life. Heidegger calls this inauthenticity of life Verfallen, which translates into fallenness. Ultimately, he is trying to elaborate on the everydayness of our life, in which Dasein's immersion of the world and our being in the world revolves around menial traditions, rituals, and the social expectations that society imprints on us. But according to Heidegger, there is a being in which we escape Verfallen. We can almost look past the everydayness of life. Heidegger explains the how in Befindlichkeit. I think I said that right. Befindlichkeit translates roughly into how one finds oneself. Our being finds itself in a situation where one is radically thrown into the world from birth. A birth in which no one really asked for. This is where we get into the existentialism of Heidegger and its philosophical relation to others such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Soren Kierkegaard, and even Simone de Beauvoir. Heidegger calls this mode of understanding our being Verstehen, which roughly translates to understanding. And the understanding mainly points towards the infinite amount of possibilities that we have in our life within the finite span of time. With Dasein being in the world, on the opposite of the finite spectrum of life, we have Das Nichts, which roughly translates into nothing. This is likely symbolized as death, as completely void, as something at the end of the journey. Heidegger saw the realization of the finite span of time that we have as the ultimate gateway towards authenticity and the ultimate gateway towards being in the world. Because ultimately, understanding time and our place within it is ultimately understanding Dasein. It's understanding our being in the world. It's right here that the notion of being and time are brought together. In essence, time is the form of human life, according to Heidegger. The structural moments where we contend with time mentally is what Heidegger calls a temporal ecstasy. The ahead of itself manifests as the futural, the very future. The already in a world manifests the past or having been, anything that has been in the past. And being, alongside, manifests the present. Actualization of the other two moments is what ultimately creates our conception of the present. Heidegger quotes this as follows: "We reach out towards the future while taking up our past, thus yielding our present activities. Note how the future, and hence the aspect of possibility, has priority over the other two moments." In essence, being able to understand the future and past, being able to understand the past where at once was birth, then the impending future of death, creates the ultimate understanding of the present. Not only does it create the ultimate understanding of the present as a conception, but as a manifested reality, a reality of the finite and our finite amount of time here.
Because it is an anxiety before the fear of nothingness.
Right, and you see how that's such a core existential idea, right? Like this whole idea of like, what even is existence? What even is like being a human being? Like what does it mean to be experiencing things and perceiving things and interpreting things and making meaning and having our own experience and having a psychology and a spirit and all this stuff?
It's an anxiety in the face of death. Don't want to make it sound, too scary, but I've already said it is a democratic institution. It is something you need to deal with. And again, we're looking for universal structures. One of the structures of all stories about the selves, even the ones we tell ourselves, no matter how disconnected they may be, they end in this rather interesting institution, death. Very interesting institution. Well, he examines the mood of anxiety then, not as a mere mood that just comes upon you once in a while, but as an underlying structure of what it means to be human.
Thus the crowd, thus the inauthentic life, the socially imposed norms become far less attractive. Heidegger argued this is when we become authentic, when we interact with the world and being with the understanding of the finite. We start to do things because we want to, not necessarily because we have to follow along with the norm. Further, Heidegger's understanding of unity and the unity of being is incredibly important in a physical and even non-physical level. Since being is being, it is the fundamental backdrop behind everything. You, the plants, the animals, and even concepts behind everything is simply being. And with the term thrownness, as we discussed beforehand, you are thrusted into the world, into being. This supposes a level of unity between everything, a unity of you, a unity of the world. Further, the structure of Heideggerian philosophy and analytics show that concepts and things cannot exist without you, since existence only exists within our perception, and the reality without our perception is completely irrelevant to our existence. A good example of this is if a tree falls and no one is around to hear it or see it, and no one ever finds it, did it actually happen? Heidegger would likely respond as if that just simply didn't matter at all. And he would further respond with, it completely depends on the perspective in which you are coming from. Do you hold the perspective of a Trump supporter? Do you hold the perspective of a Nazi or an ex-Nazi? Maybe a bona fide political liberal. The date and time and the perspective in which you hold the being of something changes that being in its entirety. Therefore, dealing with things outside our sphere of being is not very sensical philosophy to Heidegger. This is just another aspect in what time plays in our being. The implication of being in time is immense in the world. Heidegger is ultimately teaching us to become far more vulnerable people, far more vulnerable humans, understanding our direct conceptual and physical unity with everything in the world. Further, we must be completely aware of the infinitude of ideas, the infinite number of perceptions that may come to us throughout our finite period of time, between birth and death. Therefore, we must occasionally check our dogmatism. We should occasionally check our biases. And in doing this, recognizing our unity, recognizing the infinite amount of ideas and perceptions that may come to us, we hit a place of human authenticity. Further, Heidegger expresses that there are ways to understand Dasein. There are ways to understand being a being and understanding being. Separating yourself from the mundaneness of general life and society, the day-to-dayness, going to work, and general responsibilities. Taking a walk in the middle of nowhere, taking a walk in the woods, perceiving the unity in everything around you. Heidegger expresses a type of specialness in human being, in simply being a human. And this specialness of being is something we should not take for granted. We should be fully aware of our unity, of our closeness to nature, our closeness to other animals, beings, and even the conceptual relationship with concepts. Understanding this vulnerability of ourselves is what will create a more authentic human, an authentic self, and ultimately, a more authentic life. Thank you guys so much for watching. This was hands down the most difficult video I have had to make. Heidegger, hands down, is the most difficult philosopher for me to understand, and even secondary resources on him were extremely difficult to siphon through. To the world, always in the mode of representing subject, but argues... I don't understand a fucking goddamn thing here. This video over being in time is an only one-part video of a three-part series. The next video coming up will be Heidegger's work on the question of technology, which is honestly probably my favorite work of his. But you could never talk about the question of technology without talking about being in time and his concepts before it. Ultimately with this video, what I wanted to do is I wanted to create a video that no one really has been able to pull off. I noticed some videos on Heidegger are extremely analytical and they're extremely good at explaining his logic and concepts, but they ultimately fail to mention the real world implications that we would probably feel. And then further, there are other videos talking about the real world implications and the physical reality of his work, yet they kind of fail to mention his actual important concepts and his important logic behind his work. Hopefully I was able to pull this off. But as always, guys, if you did enjoy the video, please leave a like. If you want to see more, feel free to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Also, I have a Twitch channel. I stream Tuesday, Thursday, Friday at 7 o'clock, and it would be cool to hang out with you guys. Also, if you guys want to join the Discord down below, feel free to reach out to me, talk to me anytime, and or reach out to me on my socials. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and thank you for the support.
Heidegger is definitely one of the most difficult philosophers. But his influence was so huge, right? One of the reasons why he's such a hugely important person on this list is just his influence on the people coming later. And yeah, just a major name in phenomenology specifically, but also in this greater body of existential literature.
We are each born into this world without choosing. To our parents, to our certain location of time and space, to the particular conditions of our body. As we open our eyes, we peer out at a world moving around and onto us. We exist here and in the oncoming fleeting moments of our infancy, with no say in any of it. Soon we will age past.
See, this is Sartre. Welcome to Sartre. This is again, I may as well just tell you as we're going, right? Like, as you know, I'm kind of recording this throughout the weekend, and so this is, for me, it's like almost noon on Sunday. And I really want my real goal and dream with this presentation. I've been thinking about this presentation ever since I thought about, or ever since I kind of proposed the idea for this course. And my idea is that, like, existentialism is such a thick body of literature. Like, we could spend a whole course on Dostoevsky, or a whole course on Nietzsche, a whole course on Heidegger, a whole course on Kant, or a whole course on Schopenhauer, and then it's like, oh, we could do a whole course on Camus, we could do a whole course on Colin Wilson, we could do a whole course on Kafka, we could do a whole course on all these people. Now it's like, okay, I'm just trying to remember the names. That's not even talking about, like, Zoroaster and Plato, who we started with, right? So it's like all these, and Pascal, and all and Hegel and Husserl. It's like all these people. Husserl I wrote about a lot in my PhD. In my PhD I was writing more about phenomenology, so it was more like Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty. And Husserl is like kind of the father of phenomenology, and Heidegger's like sort of like the huge voice from it, and this guy too. So let's keep going with this. And yeah, you're saying like how you, that first point is just how you're kind of like thrown into the world. And it's such a deep concept, and I like see it so much because I have a 5-month-old, right? A 6-month-old. I should put a picture of her on this slide. If I remember to, I'll do it, because she just turned 6 yesterday, and it's like so fascinating because she's, when I see her grow, I can see this concept of a mind emerging in a world that it's sort of just dropped into. And I see her blooming mind. It's like honestly the best part of my life. And her and my 5-year-old, and it's like, you know, now you got me all reflective, but it's like, these are the things that matter, these are the things that sustain you. It's like, and this is sort of my point with this course, is like there's so much cultural messaging and stuff these days, and my goal with this presentation isn't to turn everybody into existentialists, because it's like there is this tendency, this is the Nietzsche worry of like focusing on this stuff all the time, leading you towards nihilistic interpretations of things, and like almost this like constant pessimism that's like no good for anyone, and exactly the opposite of what all the people around you need from you right now. So how do you have that depth without that pessimistic Chicken Little mentality? And this is what I'm trying to say is like the essence of what could make positive psychology an actual like hardcore legitimate, not like a major force, and maybe like understanding some of this. And my point here is that the phenomenology and the existential understandings help add depth, but the solutions, in my opinion, aren't action-based enough. And this is where I think positive psychology has something to add to, and this is where especially some of the stuff we're going to get later to in the course around like very specific sport psychology around understanding things like drive and motivation, once we add that to the mix. But this is the cognitive layer. This is sort of the philosophical underpinning.
Past infanthood and into our cognizant awareness of ourself and the material world around us. And soon, to paraphrase existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, we will begin to face the problem of choosing what we do with what's been done to us, to decide what we make of everything, what it all might mean, and what we do with it. Jean-Paul Sartre is one of the most widely recognized and cited thinkers of existential philosophy, a movement of thinking that took form during the 19th century, fashioned by individuals like Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, and
see, if I'm not mistaken, he's one of the first to kind of use the term existential and existentialism. So like people like earlier in the presentation at this point, like people like Plato or people like, well, even people like Nietzsche wouldn't have called themselves that, but their work will be classified sometimes as that because of the content matter.
Fyodor Dostoevsky, and then further popularized by individuals including Albert Camus, Martin Heidegger, and of course, Sartre. In Sartre's lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, he famously summarized the primary existential principle with the line, "Existence precedes essence." Essence here meaning the qualities of a thing that create its purpose.
Like you existing, existence comes before essence. sit with that one for a minute. That's like a tough one to explain quick, but like that's basically his philosophy. If you think of precedes as just meaning comes before, existence comes before that existence meaning anything.
For example, Sartre references how a paper knife is designed with a specific purpose in mind before it is made, and only once it is given a predetermined purpose and designed accordingly is it manufactured into being, in which case its essence precedes its existence. With exception to itself, humanity does this with nearly everything it makes. As rational beings, we create out of reason. Even if the reason is to make the point that we can create things for no reason, we have merely found ourselves in the paradox of creating for the reason of having none, which remains a reason. We exist with the innate desire for reason, what we do, who we are, why we are, and so on. And here lies the beginning of our existential problem. According to Sartre and many others, there is no predetermined meaning or reason to human life. There is no authority figure designing us or our lives, and there is no essence to our existence prior to our existence. But rather, life exists for itself, and beyond itself, it is intrinsically meaningless. Whenever our sense of reason and
See, this is an important kind of contextualization point, is that a lot of this philosophy is emerging in this response to this. And I know I said this in the Nietzsche one, but to this decline in the religious mind of Europe, and that while this was making everybody depressed and anxious and isolated and lacking meaning and what Durkheim would call anime, or this thought of this like existential emptiness.
logic confront this potential realization that the nature of life, including the most essential part of our life, ourself, appears to not agree with the same order of reason, we can often find ourselves in a sort of existential crisis. However, Sartre and the existentialists don't see this as despairing, but rather justification for living. If we are not made with a specific purpose prior to being, we create our purpose through our being. In other words, only through the choices we make and the actions we take in life can we create who we are and what life means. Man, Sartre said, is nothing else but what he purposes. He exists only insofar as he realizes himself. He is therefore nothing else but the sum of his actions, nothing else but what his life is. The byproduct of this, of life's inherent meaninglessness, is an inherent freedom. A freedom to choose who we are, how we live, and what matters to us. And here we experience the next rung of our existential problem, the anxiety or anguish of choice. With essentially an infinite potential number of choices and combination of choices for how to live and think and be, the anxiety of choosing properly can be rather heavy. Ironically though, the choice we make here in reaction to the...
Remember we talked about this the other week with that idea of existential anxiety around freedom? Because then if you're free to make choices, then you have agency and responsibility.
Anxiety of choice is perhaps the most important choice of all. The easier, knee-jerk response to the anxiety of choice is simply just not choosing. To mindlessly assimilate popular common templates and ideas of life, following standard routes of belief and purpose laid forth for us, and deflecting nearly all the responsibility of choice onto others and the circumstances of our life. However, Sartre referred to this as bad faith, a form of lying to ourselves and denying our basic freedom, a short-term attempt to dampen the anxiety of being that in turn costs the potential loss of our true self and true sense of the world. Even choosing to not choose is still a choice. There is no escaping the requirement of choice. Choice can only be minimized to choosing or not choosing. And this is perhaps the fundamental existential choice, to choose or not to choose. For in this choice, one either harnesses the anguish of human freedom or relinquishes it, either builds a life of intention or lives a life of complacency. We each have our little flickers of time here. No one else will ever know much, if any, of what it's like to be who we are. And for the most part, no one will ever really care. Our life is ultimately our life, and so long as we are not harming others in the process, we must create a life of our own meaning, determining our own objects of importance, committing to their pursuance, and reaping the significance and wonder of life along the way. Truthfully, we seldom have sufficient enough information to properly make any choice, including how much we might agree with Sartre or anyone else. Throughout our life, we are faced with serious decisions about what we believe, who we are, and what we do, and mostly none of it is self-evident. And if we look, we will always find a reason to regret any decision we make. Move or stay, agree or disagree, take the job or quit, marry or divorce, live one path or another. In all cases, whatever the choice may be, we will only ever know the outcome of the one we take, and none we take will ever ultimately resolve the uncertainty of life. However, perhaps it is less about getting a potential course of life right, and more about attempting to do so with an effort of self-honesty and virtue, to live a life that can be looked back at with the knowledge that some of our decisions were perhaps wrong in their effects, but right in their intention of not selling ourselves short. It is, of course, incredibly hard and complicated to grapple with life, to consider the abstract concepts of existence and meaning and being. However, the overwhelm and challenge found in this, in the whirlpool of uncertainty, absurdity, and responsibility, is perhaps the unavoidable price of the great gift that we all are given at birth. But it is just that, a gift. And to face up to the abyss, to feel the anguish of choice and potentiality, to bear the weight of self, all are but visceral, humbling, beautiful reminders of the potency of life running through our veins. And perhaps our only job is to realize this and make the gift worth its price. Agree with Sartre or not, ultimately, his ideas are a reminder to do just that, to risk the easy and commonplace for the unique and great, to work towards our full potentials in the face of all obstacles, including ourselves, to take responsibility for our life and what we make of it. Ultimately, no matter what we do or say or believe, there will always be a great many who disagree or judge or ridicule or become upset by our decisions. But it is of essential importance that we try as often as possible to ensure that among those people, ourself is not one of them.
Ooh, awesome. Pursuit of wonder. Subscribe. Oh, nice. This one doesn't have a long ending. Alright, that was an awesome introduction. This presentation is starting to get crazy long, and I apologize, so I'm going to be a bit quick at the end. And Merleau-Ponty deserves comment, and especially this alterity, or this word of like being different, or this idea that like I'll never totally be you, you'll never be me. For Merleau-Ponty, a responsible treatment of this otherness difference consists in recognizing that this otherness difference is always already intertwined within our subjectivity. It's already such a part of my experience and your experience. This fact that we're different. It's like that, yeah, that shaped how I've understood everything. It's shaped how you've understood everything. It's how we've understood each other. Right, and that's why he's saying, like, that's why an individual who's confronted with this idea is essentially inaccessible to it. It's beyond comprehension. It's so core. Far from being a negative thing, the alterity of the other is too complicated to simply be posited as that which will forever elude us. And such a description ignores the important ways in which self and other are intertwined. It's like, just because you're different, it's like, yeah, I'll never be able to experience the world as you experience it. But that doesn't mean I'm a complete stranger to you. And part of the alterity, uniqueness of us, gives a beauty to humanity. It's cool that we take things differently. You know, you're not just a cookie cutter brain. You're you. So I like Camus, this next person we're going to be looking at, and he's one of the most recent. There's the last two are recent. This is going to be the last video, and this video I'm about to show does a really nice job of presenting this idea of absurdism and what this means. Right, this absurd relationship between us and the world we're in. The absurd man, like an astronaut looking at the earth from above, wonders whether a philosophical system, a religion, a political ideology is able to make the world respond to the questioning of man, or rather, whether all human constructions are nothing but the excessive face paint of a clown, which is there to cover his sadness. Yikes.
At any street corner, the feeling of absurdity can strike any man in the face. Albert Camus. For any number of reasons, in any moment, we can find ourselves questioning everything. A moment where the fabric of our existence splits open, and even the simplest and normal seeming of things become strange and confusing. A tree, a chair, the conditions of the world, other people's behaviors, our own behaviors, our job, our purpose, our life, our death, and so on, might all come into question as to what they are and why they are. For many, this moment becomes more than just a moment. It becomes an inescapable perspective. Arguably, if anyone is to experience this and is to consider the essence of human existence with honesty and depth, they will inevitably reach the conclusion of how little we know about said essence. The conclusion will be met with the realization that the world and our life within it is currently without any clear ultimate meaning, purpose, or answers.
I love this guy's videos.
In the current age, this conclusion seems to be met rather easily and frequently as information spills onto the individual and reveals how apparently chaotic and contradictory this world really is. Unfortunately, however, this conclusion can lead to a bleak sense of life, a sense of hopelessness, pointlessness, and alienation. In the past, mythical or religious narratives and doctrines would be looked towards in order to resolve this confusion of purpose and meaning. Notions of a benevolent God, ultimate divinity, and an afterlife would provide structure, comfort, purpose, and reconciliation. However, in regards to modern life, starting in the early 20th century, traditional religious principles would begin to degrade in popularity as new conditions of the world would unfold and render the modern individual increasingly skeptical of assumed religious narratives of the past. This degradation continues to work its course today as the world moves past supposed narrative methods and ideologies and seeks new ways of understanding the universe and finding our purpose within it. Science, technology, and logic have and continue to become increasingly popular areas of focus in the modern world. However, regardless of logic, science, and technology's fast speeds and capabilities, for many of us, we remain only to be further confused, anxious, and alienated from life. In the modern era, the world seemingly reveals itself as a new shade of color every other day, as conflicting ideas, conclusions, and understandings come in and out of consensus, making it hard to hold on to or care about any sort of mathematically formulated understanding of our life. Perhaps then, the complexity and meaning of human experience cannot be contorted into any rational and universal box. Or perhaps it can, and we just have yet to figure out the proper packaging. In either case, if we find ourselves in the position where neither religion nor reason is able to help us find some meaning to our life, we are still left, right now, in need of some resolution. In an attempt to deal with the elusive problem of finding meaning and purpose in a life that appears to have none, we will look to the 20th century French-Algerian writer and philosopher, Albert Camus. Camus was associated with the existential school of thought, a school of thought that was an early advocate of the idea that life is without any ultimate meaning or truth. More specifically, Camus was a proponent of the idea that our relationship with the universe is completely and fundamentally absurd. However, what makes Camus' insight highly unique and helpful is the way in which he wrestled with this notion and arguably came out victorious. What makes something absurd in the mind of Camus can best be described with this following analogy. If I see a man armed only with a sword attack a group of machine guns, I shall consider his act to be absurd. But it is so solely by virtue of the disproportion between his intention and the reality he will encounter, of the contradiction I notice between his true strength and the aim he has in view. From the simplest to the most complex, the magnitude of the absurdity will be in direct ratio to the distance between the two terms of my comparison. The absurd is essentially a divorce. It lies in neither of the elements compared. It is born of their confrontation. In other words, neither the human nor the universe are necessarily absurd on their own, but rather their relationship is absurd. As humans, we exist with an innate desire for meaning, reason, and order, yet we simultaneously exist in a universe that appears to lack all of the above. Rather, so far as we can tell, the universe is completely indifferent. Thus, what we want and expect from the universe is fundamentally in contradiction with what we get. In this conflict, the absurdity and despair of human experience is found. Based on this idea, we are in fact without any grand meaning beyond ourselves. We cannot create any utopic order out of this universe, and we lack access to any endgame purpose or truth that will give us a sense of finality and consolation. However, despite the realization of our meaninglessness, or at least our inability to find true meaning, Camus rejects the nihilistic hopelessness that might sound like a reasonable conclusion, but rather provokes the absurdity of life as a means of finding worthy and potent experience within it. For Camus, to become aware of and accept the absurdity of life is to transcend it. We may live strange, absurd lives in an indifferent universe, but rather than hopelessness, despair, or worst of all, suicide, we should accept life's absurdity, make it our own, and overcome it. In his profound essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus references the famous Greek story of Sisyphus as a powerful allegory and teaching to overcome life's futile meaninglessness. In the story, as a result of trying to outsmart the gods, the Greek king Sisyphus is condemned as punishment to roll a
Pushing
giant
the
rock
rock
up a hill.
You've heard
As
this
part
as
of
a
the punishment,
metaphor,
however,
and
every time Sisyphus gets to the top of the hill, the rock
Over and
rolls
over and
back
over and
down
over
to
and
the
over.
bottom, forcing Sisyphus to start again, over and
Sisyphus.
over for all of eternity. For
Every
absolutely
day.
no reason other than the process itself, Sisyphus rolls this rock up the hill, only to watch it roll back down again and again. In this,
Punishment
Camus
from the
draws
gods.
connection between the tiresome and futile fate of Sisyphus and the fate of the human experience. However, also in this comparison, Camus writes, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." With this, Camus poses the hopeful yet reasonable assertion that even in the ordinary, repetitive, and likely futile experience of our everyday life, we can and should still find worthy experience and happiness. For Camus, there are plenty of tremendous reasons to endure the potential absurdity and pointlessness of rolling the rock up and down the hill. All of the things that exist around the rock that tend to seem as though they are less important than getting the rock to the top of the hill. The sun, the trees, the refreshing breeze, the friends, the relationships, the family, the art, the self-exploration,
man. This
and anything
video,
else we
this
can
guy
find
makes-
interesting and wondrous are, for Camus, all there is
So
and all there
true.
needs to be. Furthermore, it is only in the absurdity of life that any of these things can have the potential for intrigue and wonder, and it is up to us to be conscious of this and bring meaning out of them. Unlike anything else in the known universe, we are able to consciously observe, consider, reason, and act in this life. As a result of our exclusive abilities, we ask ourselves, why? We desperately try to find the answers. We get increasingly clever in our attempts, yet every answer, just like that of the rock in the myth of Sisyphus, at some point returns to the bottom of the hill, leaving us to start again. As a result of this constant inability to satiate our desire for ultimate meaning and truth, we can often find ourselves drudging over the seeming absurdity and futility of it all. However, Camus felt that even in the conflict of absurdity, we can be okay and still live happy lives so long as we accept the absurdity. In the acceptance of our absurd human experience, we realize that the point is not to eliminate absurdity or find and defend some ultimate truth, but rather it is to be conscious and appreciative of the things within the absurdity, to look for, find, and create things that are interesting and personally meaningful. Furthermore, Camus suggested that in the recognizing of our absurdity, we can better accept and share value with the people around us because we understand that we are all struggling victims of this absurd life. For Camus, continuing on in life and using its absurdity as a means of virtue, exploration, art, and unique experience is perhaps the highest and most worthy achievement in human life. When referencing the predicament of Sisyphus' fate, Camus writes, "The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart."
Pursuit of wonder. Do you have a long outro here? No, a quick one. Pursuit of Wonder, killer YouTube channel. And what I tried to do, if you're like, well, hasn't like what this teacher like put a video that he hasn't seen in the presentation, but what I tried to do is, and I think I'm at this point we're going to be super deep in the presentation. This is the second last slide, but like you'll probably have got the point that what I did was with these Pursuit of Wonder videos, I've been watching this guy's videos for a long time. I know that the quality of his videos, and I know the depth, and I know his narrative approach, but also his like kind of depth and stuff. So I knew that picking his videos, and you'll notice it, there were very specific ones. It was like this one, Heidegger, James, and Nietzsche. Like those are all tough ones, and those are all ones that I thought would be add a cool element to this video if I kind of showed a video that I was super familiar with the topic, super familiar with the creator, but hadn't recently viewed that specific video, right? Just to add a little bit of watching it with you to it, but watching with you something that I had been exposed to in different ways, right? So it's like, it's really interesting to just hear how he presented that definition there of absurdity. It's in some ways like the cleanest I've ever heard it. This idea of like, it's not that the world's necessarily crazy or that we're crazy, it's the link. And sorry to use the word crazy. I meant to use the word absurd. It's absurd. It's wild. You know, whatever word you want to use, that's the right word to use. Let me just paint the two sides, right? It's like absurdity is the word he's using to put in the middle, and it's like the two sides. On the one side, it's like this idea of who I am, psychologically and spiritually and emotionally and memory-wise and identity-wise and family-wise, and that exists in a world that is both what gives all of that meaning and at the same time is largely cold to that. And it's like everyone else has that too. And it is absurd to think about it, sort of. And it's like, this again, what makes this existential is this focus on the underlying nature of existence and our relationship to it. Finally, I'd like to shout out the last. First of all, I'd like to shout out you students if you've hung in here. This is at like almost 3 hours and 20 minutes. I'm so sorry, and this is going to be maybe my longest presentation ever. But I think we covered a lot of ground. Colin Wilson, you know, the major existential writer. The first existential writer I ever read, The Outsider, was recommended to me when I was younger. I'd recommend it to all of you. Fascinating book. And he also wrote a book that I read called The Lord of the Underworld, which is different than earlier when I was talking about Dostoevsky. I actually referred to his book as Lord of the Underworld, which was a mistake. Now I remember that Dostoevsky's book's actually called Notes from the Underground. Lord of the Underworld was Wilson's book about Jung. So if you wrote that in your notes, if you could correct that back at the Dostoevsky Crime and Punishment slide. That I said another one of his books was Lord of the Underworld, but actually it's Notes from the Underground. That was an awesome book about the prison guard explaining what it's like to the new one. Yeah, so sorry I mixed up those titles. But yeah, I'll end you with this quote. Love yous. Thanks for watching. Have a great time. Next thing you'll get from me is going to be a description of the next assignment, which will probably come in the next few days. And the next content video presentation will be about sort of biological and evolutionary influences on our understanding of groups. And then the week after that, it'll be more the therapeutic understandings. Alright, when we pull back and get for a moment the bird's eye view of life, it reveals meanings that are ungraspable by the narrow focus of our usual worm's eye view. I love you. Have a great week. Don't have a worm's eye view. Have a bird's eye view. That's the best I can do for an ending. Cheers.